Hello everyone and welcome back to the Unexplained Diaries. Here on this channel I share real-life encounters with beings from beyond the skies to help you unwind and drift off to sleep. Before we dive in, I would love to hear from you. Leave a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. Now, find a comfortable spot, relax, and let's begin. It was the end of March, still cold enough in Fife that your breath hung in the air after sunset. I was 17 then, living in Kirkcaldy, finishing my last year at the high school. It was a Friday night, and I was out near the coastal path with three mates from school, Ewan, Grant, and Lisa. We weren't doing anything special, just sitting on the low stone wall near the dunes, sharing a bag of chips from the chippy and watching the tide come in. It was about 9:30, maybe 10. The streetlights behind us didn't reach that far, so it was mostly dark except for the glow from the town a mile away. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it got. The waves were still there, but the usual wind off the water had died completely. We'd been laughing about something Grant said when Lisa pointed out toward the water and asked what that was. At first, I thought she meant a boat's light, but there was no boat. Three lights were hovering just above the horizon, evenly spaced, glowing a dull orange like embers. They didn't flicker and they didn't move. We stood up on the wall to get a better look. They were far enough out that you couldn't tell if they were over the water or in the sky, but definitely not on the shore. Ewan pulled out his phone, tried to film, but the screen showed nothing but black. He tried again with flash on, still nothing. I remember he swore under his breath and shoved the phone back in his pocket. We watched those lights for maybe a minute, trying to make sense of them. No sound, no movement. Then, as we were arguing about whether it could be flares or some kind of aircraft, the middle light dropped straight down into the water, or at least that's how it looked. The other two blinked out at the same time, leaving nothing but dark sea. We stayed there a while, waiting for something else to happen, but it didn't. After another few minutes, the wind came back in a rush, cold and salty. We decided to head home, agreeing not to say anything to our parents because it sounded too weird. Nothing happened over the weekend. Monday morning we were back at school, first period maths. It wasn't until third period English that something odd happened. Mrs. Cowie, our teacher, stepped out of the room for a second, then came back looking unsettled. She told us to keep reading quietly. Through the window, I saw two men walking down the corridor toward the staff room. Both were in black suits, crisp like they'd just come from a funeral or a court hearing. Black ties, white shirts. One was tall and thin, the other shorter but broad. At break, Lisa found me by the lockers. "Did you see those guys?" she asked. She'd seen them too. Ewan and Grant joined us, both saying they'd noticed the men in the corridor. It wasn't normal. No one came to our school dressed like that except maybe inspectors. But even then, they didn't look like that. Their faces were pale, hair neatly parted. They weren't carrying folders or clipboards. Later, during lunch, we overheard one of the younger teachers whispering to another in the staff room doorway. She said something like, "They're asking if anyone's been talking about the sky." That's when I felt my stomach drop. We hadn't told anyone about the lights. None of us had. When we went back to class after lunch, the two men were in the hallway again, this time speaking quietly with the head teacher, Mr. Forbes. They weren't smiling, and he looked uneasy. They glanced at us as we passed, but didn't say anything. It wasn't a normal glance either. It felt deliberate, like they were checking off faces in their heads. By the time last period rolled around, the men were gone. We asked one of the office staff who they were, but she just said she didn't know, and her tone suggested she didn't want to talk about it. That night, the four of us met up again at Lisa's place. We were all shaken by how specific their question had been. Talking about the sky. Out of everything they could have asked, it was that. Ewan swore he hadn't told anyone about the lights, and none of us had posted about it online. We were certain. Over the next week, little things happened that felt off. A black car parked across from the school during lunch breaks, engine off, windows up. Always the same car. The driver never got out. Once, when Grant tried to get a closer look, it drove off slowly, not quickly like it was worried about being caught. At home, my phone started doing strange things. Once, during a call with Ewan, There was a faint clicking sound, and then dead silence for a few seconds before the call resumed. Another time, I found the screen recording app open even though I hadn't touched it. Lisa said her mom answered the house phone one night and heard nothing but breathing. We never saw the men again inside the school. But about 2 weeks later, walking home after dark, I thought I saw them across the street near the bus stop. Same suits, same stance, looking straight ahead. I blinked, and a car passed between us, and when it cleared, they were gone. I wasn't sure if I'd imagined it. The coastal path where we'd seen the lights stayed empty after that. We went back once, early evening on a Sunday, but none of us could relax. Every sound felt amplified, the gulls, the wind, the traffic farther inland. We didn't see any lights, but we left after only 10 minutes. Even now, when I drive that way at night, I catch myself scanning the horizon for those orange glows. And at the school, whenever someone mentions inspectors or visitors, I picture the two men in black suits asking our teachers about the sky, and how they somehow knew to ask before anyone had said a word. I had finished lunch around 1 that afternoon and decided to walk up to Arthur's Seat. The sky was clear, a pale winter blue, and the city had that quiet, washed-out feeling you get just after snow melts. I usually take my camera when I go up there, just to catch shots of the city from the hill. It's one of those things that's more habit than hobby, but I like having something tangible to remember the day by. I was halfway up the trail when I noticed it. Bright, hovering just above the eastern slope. Not moving, not blinking, just there. My first thought was a drone or one of those new weather balloons they'd been talking about on the news, but it didn't behave like either. It was perfectly still, symmetrical, and somehow it didn't reflect the sunlight the way the hill or the buildings did. I lifted my camera and snapped a few shots, holding my breath to make sure the focus was sharp. I watched for a few more minutes, but it stayed put. The city noise seemed to fade into background hum, and there was this odd stillness around me, like the air had gotten thicker. Then I blinked, and it was gone. Just gone. No motion, no fade, nothing. I kept taking pictures as I walked back down, hoping to catch some trace of it in the frame. Later at home, I went through the photos on my computer. There it was in several shots, bright and clearly visible above the trees, just like I'd seen it. I zoomed in, adjusted contrast and exposure, and every time it popped back into view on the screen. I didn't tell anyone about it, at least not right away. The next morning, I got into the office early. My workplace is small, one of those independent design studios in the old town, the kind with exposed brick and creaky floors. I had just booted up my computer when the door opened. Two men in suits stepped in. Black suits, white shirts, ties that weren't patterned. Shoes shined so much they caught the morning light and sent it glinting across the floor. "Good morning," the taller one said, voice even, measured. "We need to inspect your camera for errors." I froze. My camera? I hadn't left it anywhere unusual. What?" I said. He nodded at the bag on my desk. "Please." I reached for it, and he stepped closer, silent, expressionless. The shorter one didn't say anything, just scanned the office, the eyes moving in a way that made it feel like they were measuring everything. The distance between my desk and the window, the angles of the monitors, the layout of the room. I didn't want to hand over the camera, but there was a strange weight in the air that made me comply. They handled it quickly, turning the lens this way and that, pressing buttons, but not in a way that seemed normal. I noticed that whenever I tried to look at the screen or viewfinder, they would subtly shift, blocking my line of sight. After a few minutes, they nodded at each other. "Errors noted," the taller man said. "That will suffice." Then, just like that, they left. No goodbye, no explanation, no footprints in the dusty floor. I sat there staring at the door, my heart racing, waiting for some rational follow-up that never came. I went straight home after work and checked the photos again. The object was gone. Every image that had shown it clearly the day before now had an empty sky, normal clouds, the sun in the same position, but no bright shape hovering above the slope. I tried opening the raw files, different programs, even my memory card in another computer. Every time, it was missing. I thought maybe I had misremembered. Maybe my mind had filled in the object where there wasn't one, but The original files I'd copied to my backup drive the night before had been intact, showing the object clearly. Now even those were gone. The folder was still there, images all accounted for, but the one frame with the object had changed. I called my friend Mark, who's a hobbyist photographer, just to confirm I wasn't going crazy. I described the photos, the object, everything. He was skeptical, of course. Maybe a lens flare, he said. I laughed it off at first, but deep down I didn't think it could be explained that way. The next week, I kept noticing odd things. Black cars parked near the studio that I hadn't seen before, always with darkened windows. Figures in long coats at the end of the street, standing perfectly still, watching, then disappearing when I looked directly at them. I tried to rationalize it, tell myself it was coincidence, paranoia, maybe the city just had weird shadows and people who didn't move much. But the weight of the camera incident, the missing object, the silence of the men in black, it made rational explanations feel thin. One night, I went back up Arthur's Seat. I just wanted to see the place again, to ground myself, maybe catch another shot, and prove I wasn't imagining anything. The city lights twinkled below, the mist rolling in patches along the hills. I kept the camera ready, eyes scanning. Nothing appeared, no bright shape, no drone, no flare. But the feeling of being watched was back, subtle but persistent. Every shadow at the edge of my vision seemed exaggerated. Every slight movement in the fog felt like an intrusion. Since then, I haven't left my camera unattended in the office or at home. I don't talk about the incident much, because there's no way to make it make sense. Sometimes I still look at the backup files, hoping the object will reappear, hoping some error reversed itself. It never does. I can't explain why they came or why the photos changed, only that they did. The men in black, if that's what they were, never returned, but I keep an eye out anyway. On clear days, when the city stretches below me and the wind cuts across the hill, I wonder if something's up there, or watching from the mist, keeping tabs. It's a small, quiet dread, the kind that doesn't scream but lingers, settling in your chest in a way that makes you second-guess the ordinary. I keep taking photos. I keep climbing the hill. But I know that some things, once noticed, never entirely leave you alone. It happened on a wet Tuesday night in late September. I was driving home from a delivery run in my old white transit van, heading south on the A9 near Perth. The rain had been coming down steady all afternoon, that fine, misty kind that doesn't look like much until it soaks through your jacket. The road was mostly empty, except for the occasional lorry. It was about 9:30. I remember glancing at the dash clock when it first started. I just passed the turnoff for Luncardy when I noticed a light in my side mirror. At first, I thought it was a motorbike, one single headlight bouncing in the dark. But it didn't move like a bike. It was too steady, no wobble, no variation in height, and the glow wasn't the hard white of an LED. It was softer, pale, almost like the color of a halogen street lamp. I eased off the accelerator, thinking maybe someone was tailgating me. The light slowed exactly as I slowed, holding its position off my right rear corner, maybe 20 feet out. I sped up a bit, testing it. It matched me perfectly. 70, 75. I know the limit's 60 for vans, but that stretch is long and empty at night. The light stayed with me. My hands started to sweat on the wheel. The rain on the windscreen blurred everything except that pale glow hanging behind me. I remember thinking, maybe it's some kind of drone. But who would fly one in that weather, at those speeds, next to a van? At the time, the speedometer needle was sitting dead on 72. I kept glancing at it because it felt like the only fixed point in the whole moment. The van's engine sounded normal. Nothing flickered inside, but the light behind me, it didn't reflect on the road surface or on the van's body. It was just there, a floating ball, pacing me. After maybe 3 miles, I came up on a slower car and had to overtake. The orb, I don't know what else to call it, shifted position. It slid smoothly to the other side, lining up with my left rear quarter instead. Same distance. No sound, no shadow, just rain on the roof and my own breathing getting louder. It broke off just before the Broxton roundabout. 1 second it was there, the next it wasn't. No fade, no darting away, just gone. I actually slowed to 50 for a bit, expecting it to come back. Nothing. By the time I pulled into my driveway in Craigie, I'd convinced myself it had been a reflection or some weird vehicle light I hadn't understood. My wife asked why I was pale. I said I was tired. That was it. 3 days later, a Friday morning, two men came to my garage. I worked part-time out of a small unit behind an industrial estate, mostly brake jobs and tires for locals. I just rolled up the shutters when they appeared. No car that I saw. They were standing by the entrance, side by side, both in black suits. Not shiny or new, just dark, plain. White shirts, thin black ties. They weren't wet, even though it had been drizzling all morning. Their shoes were polished but had no mud on them. One was taller, maybe 6'2", with a narrow face and dark hair slicked straight back. The other was shorter, rounder head, light hair, but eyebrows so pale they were almost invisible. They both looked mid-40s. The tall one spoke first. His voice was flat, not deep, not high, just flat, like someone reading from a script. He said, "Has your speedometer stopped at 72?" I thought he was joking. My brain didn't even process it at first. I said, "What?" He repeated, slower this time. "Did your speedometer stop at 72? No hello, no name, nothing. I laughed a little nervously. "Stopped? No, it's working fine." He tilted his head just slightly, like a bird. "You're sure?" he said, but it wasn't a question. The shorter one didn't talk at all. He just stared at me. His eyes were light, maybe gray, but there was something about them that made me want to look away. His face didn't move, not bored, not angry, just blank. I asked if they needed something fixed. "This is a garage," I said, trying to sound normal. "You got car trouble?" Neither of them answered. They looked around the unit slowly, scanning everything, the racks of tires, the oil drums, the floor. The taller woman finally said, "Were you alone?" Again, not a question, more like a statement. I said, "What?" But he'd already turned to the other man. They shared a look I couldn't read. Then, without another word, they walked out. I followed them to the door, but by the time I stepped outside, they were halfway down the lane toward the street. No car waiting, no umbrella, just walking, perfectly in step, away from the estate. I watched them go until they turned the corner. When I got back inside, my phone screen was black, even though it had been charging. Wouldn't turn on for a full minute. No calls came through that morning, which is unusual for a Friday. The rest of the day I worked on a Fiesta and tried not to think about it. But there were small things. A smell, like warm electronics, lingering near the shutter even though I'd unplugged my space heater. A customer later told me two council workers had been asking around the shops about me, but the council said they hadn't sent anyone. That night, when I drove home, I kept checking my mirrors. No lights, no orb, just rain on the road and my own headlights. 2 weeks passed. Nothing else strange happened, except the van's dash clock was 2 hours slow one morning, even though the battery was fine. I asked my wife if she'd reset it. She hadn't. I started keeping the van locked inside the unit instead of on the street. A few nights, I thought I saw a black car parked near the estate when I closed up. An older Jaguar, maybe. But every time I tried to get a closer look, it would be gone by the time I reached the road. I didn't tell anyone the whole story for a while. When people asked about the orb, I said it was probably a drone. When they asked about the men, I said it was probably inspectors or something. But that question, "Has your speedometer stopped at 72? It keeps playing back in my head. They didn't ask if I'd seen anything. They didn't ask if I'd been on that road. They asked like they already knew. I still drive that route some nights, out of habit. The stretch near Lancardi feels different now. I keep one eye on the mirrors, waiting for that pale glow to appear again. It hasn't. But every time the needle hovers near 72, my palms start sweating like they did that night, and I ease back down to 60 without even thinking about it. It started on a Thursday night about a month ago. I live just outside Lerwick, in a small rented cottage at the edge of a sheep pasture. It's quiet here, even by Shetland standards. No street lights, just the sea wind and the occasional car from the next village. That night, the wind was low and the sky was clear. I'd gone outside with a mug of tea to cool off after working on my boat engine in the shed. It was close to midnight. When I first noticed the lights, I thought they were satellites, tiny moving dots far overhead, but these didn't move like satellites or planes. They darted, sharp, quick movements, stopping on a dime. There were maybe 3 or 4 of them, white but not bright, like distant stars being dragged around on strings. One zipped straight across the sky in less than a second, then halted dead. I stood there, mug in hand, watching. I don't know how long it lasted. A couple of minutes? 10? At one point, the lights formed a sort of triangle, then split apart. No noise, no trails, nothing. Just quiet sky and those weird little points moving faster than anything I'd ever seen. I tried to get my phone from inside, but by the time I came back out, the sky was empty. I didn't tell anyone. Not because I was scared, more because I couldn't even describe it properly. My neighbor, Callum, is the type who'd laugh and say it was "we folk" or NATO games. I didn't want to hear it, so I just kept it to myself. A week later, late afternoon, there was a knock on my door. Not a knock, exactly. 3 even taps, then a pause, then 2 more. When I opened it, 2 men were standing there, both in black suits. Not tuxedos or anything fancy, just plain dark suits with white shirts and narrow ties. One taller, one shorter. Their clothes looked dry, even though it had been drizzling most of the day. No car outside, no footprints on the wet gravel. The taller one did the talking. His voice was flat, steady. "Have you heard the clicking noise?" he asked. Just like that. No hello, no name. I said, "What clicking noise?" because I had no idea what he meant. He glanced at the shorter man, then back at me. "During the event. Do you hear it?" I said, "What event?" But my stomach was already sinking. I hadn't told anyone about the lights. Not a soul. My wife works on the mainland most weeks. She wasn't even home that night. The only living thing nearby was the neighbor's collie. But these men, whoever they were, knew something. I told them I hadn't heard anything. The taller one tilted his head slightly, like a bird listening. "No clicks at all?" he asked, but it didn't sound like a question. I said no. The shorter one hadn't spoken a word. He just stood there, staring at me. His face didn't move. Not bored, not angry, just blank. His eyes were pale gray, maybe blue, but they didn't seem to focus. I asked if they were with the council or something. "Is this about the pasture?" I said. "Or the boat?" They didn't answer. The taller one looked past me into the hallway like he was scanning my walls. Then he said, "If you notice the clicking, note the intervals." Those exact words. Then they both turned at the same time and walked off down the gravel drive. By the time I got my boots on and stepped outside, they were gone. The drive is long and straight. You can see all the way to the road, no one there. No car, no van, nothing. Just drizzle and gulls. That night was the first time I noticed it, lying in bed, everything off, the only sound the wind against the window. Then, faint but there, a click. Not constant, not regular, but like a fingernail tapping once on glass somewhere in the room. I got up, checked the boiler, the fuse box, the fridge. Nothing. The cottage was silent. But when I lay back down, another click. I didn't sleep much. Every time I thought it had stopped, it would start again. Sometimes just one sharp tick, sometimes a little cluster, like a Morse code I couldn't understand. The next day, I tried to record it on my phone, but when I played it back, there was nothing. Just room noise. For the next week, it was like that. No men in suits, no lights in the sky, just faint clicks in the silence. I stopped mentioning it to myself out loud. I didn't want to make it real. I even turned on a radio at night to drown it out. But when I switched it off to sleep, the clicks were back, softer, but still there. One evening, I saw a dark car parked down by the lane where it meets the main road. Old, maybe a Jaguar, black paint, no plates I could read. It was facing toward my cottage. When I stepped outside, it rolled off slowly, no lights. The sheep didn't even look up. 2 nights later, I woke up at 3 a.m. and found my kitchen light on. I never leave it on. My back door was locked, but the bolt was in the opposite position I usually leave it. Nothing missing. Just small things shifted. My mug from the sink was on the table. My boots by the door had been turned to face outward. The clicking has changed since then. It's less random now, more like a pattern. Sometimes 3 quick taps, then a pause, then 2. Exactly like the knock at the door that day. I haven't seen the men again, but sometimes when I go out at night to smoke, I feel like someone's watching from the dark edge of the pasture. No movement, no shapes, just that feeling. I've started sleeping with earplugs. Doesn't help. The clicks are faint, but seem closer now, like they're inside the room instead of outside it. I still haven't told Callum or anyone else. I wouldn't even know how to explain it. It's been 3 weeks since they came to the door. No follow-up, no letters, nothing. Just the same question echoing in my head. Have you heard the clicking noise? Because now I have. And once you've heard it, you can't stop noticing it. I was alone that weekend, camping near Loch Lomond in late October. The weather was typical for that time of year, cold, damp, and fog rolling in off the water in waves. I had chosen a small clearing near the northern shore, just far enough from the main parking area to feel like I had some privacy. My plan was simple: set up the tent, make a fire, and spend the night reading and listening to the loch. By the time I finished setting up, it was past 8 and the fog had thickened. The loch was almost invisible beyond the tree line, the water itself a flat, dark sheet that reflected nothing. I had the fire going, kettle on the edge of the stones, and I was leaning back in my folding chair when I noticed the lights. At first, I thought it was someone else camping on the opposite shore. 2 small, bright white dots, almost like headlamps, bobbing slightly. But as I watched, the dots didn't move toward me or each other, they stayed in the same place. They were definitely human-sized, standing upright. The more I looked, the more certain I became. 2 men, dark suits, standing perfectly still, just beyond the water where there was no path, no road, no dock. I rubbed my eyes, thinking I was seeing reflections or something in the fog, but when I looked again, they were still there. The wind picked up, pushing the fog around them, making their shapes appear and disappear like shadows in a thick curtain. I couldn't make out faces, just the outline of their bodies, tall, rigid, unnatural in their stillness. I tried to ignore them, told myself I must be imagining things. I poured some water into my kettle and leaned back, staring at the fire. But I couldn't stop sneaking glances. An hour passed. Then 2. They didn't move. They didn't speak. Nothing changed except the fog rolling heavier over the water and the fire crackling lower. At one point, I thought I saw one of them shift slightly, but it might have been the fog again. I considered calling out, but it felt wrong. Like speaking would break some unspoken rule. I didn't feel fear in the traditional sense, more like an awareness that I was being observed and that my presence mattered in a way I didn't understand. Around 3 in the morning, the fog was so thick that I could barely see the shoreline. The figures were still there. My fire had almost died out. I grabbed my flashlight and flicked it on, sweeping it across the loch. The beam barely reached the opposite shore, but when it did, the men were gone. Not hidden by fog, they weren't there at all. I stood up, shivering, trying to see if they had slipped back into the trees. Nothing. The water was empty, flat, still. I sat back down, too tense to sleep, until I heard a sound, leaves crunching, faint but steady, coming from the tree line along the water. I froze. The sound grew slowly, deliberate, and then 2 figures appeared from the trees where no path led. They didn't run. They didn't speak. They just walked upright, straight toward a point a few hundred yards away, then vanished behind another line of trees. I could see their silhouettes against the fog, black suits blending into the night. There were no footprints, no evidence they had walked through the undergrowth. By the time dawn broke, the fog lifted enough for me to inspect the ground where they'd been standing. Nothing. No crushed grass, no mud prints, not even broken twigs. The area was as untouched as the rest of the clearing. I packed up slowly, half expecting them to reappear, half expecting someone else to come across me in the mist. Nothing happened. Driving back to my flat in Glasgow later that morning, I kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see a black car or figures following me along the A82. I passed the same stretch of loch without seeing a thing. By the time I was back in the city, the experience felt like a dream, or like it was something I was meant to forget, if not entirely. I tried talking to friends about it, but most dismissed it. Probably other campers, or fog plays tricks on you. But I know what I saw. I know they weren't just other campers. I camp often, usually alone, and I've never seen anyone appear or disappear like that. Weeks later, I returned to the loch, this time in daylight, and retraced my route to the clearing. The shoreline was empty. The trees were the same. There was nothing to suggest that anyone had been there at all. I never saw the figures again. I haven't seen anyone in a black suit since, and I haven't returned to that campsite at night. But sometimes, driving along the A82 after work, When the light hits the water in a certain way, I catch a shadow or a flicker in the corner of my eye, and I swear I see them, standing at the edge of the loch, still, watching. I've tried to rationalize it, thinking maybe it was another camper, some prank, a trick of the fog and my own imagination. But the way they appeared, the way they disappeared, the fact that no path or boat could have brought them there, it doesn't make sense. I don't know what they were doing or why they were watching me, but I do know one thing. Whatever it was, they had been waiting. And somehow I had stumbled into their observation. I tell the story only now because it's been years, and it's stayed with me, tucked into the back of my mind where I can't quite reach it. Some nights I still picture them out there, black shapes in the fog, patient and motionless, waiting for someone else to notice. Even writing this, I check the windows, half expecting to see them on the far shore, standing silently, staring back. It was late October, and the nights were already long up here. My farm sits about 15 miles outside Inverness, a few fields, a barn, and a stone farmhouse that's been in my family since my grandfather's time. It was one of those damp nights when the air feels heavy and the stars look smeared like they're just behind a film of mist. I'd gone out around midnight to check the north field because the sheep had been restless earlier in the evening. That's when I saw it. A glow above the far end of the field, hovering just above the tree line. At first, I thought it was a helicopter or maybe a searchlight from some event in town, but there was no sound, not even the distant hum you'd expect from a rotor or an engine. It wasn't a beam of light either. The glow seemed contained, like it was part of a solid shape, but the shape itself was hard to pin down. Oval one moment, triangular the next, depending on how I shifted my head. I stood at the fence for a while, breath showing in the cold air, listening. The sheep were silent. Normally they'd scatter or make noise at something like that, but they were all pressed together near the barn, still as stones. I felt a weird pressure in my ears, the way you do when you're about to dive underwater, but faint and pulsing. After maybe 30 seconds, the glow dimmed and drifted slowly west, then blinked out entirely, leaving nothing but dark sky. I stayed out another 20 minutes, scanning, but it didn't return. I finally went back inside, made a note about it in the kitchen, just the time, the field, the direction it moved. I didn't tell anyone. The next morning, around 7, I stepped outside to feed the animals. The mist was still clinging low to the ground, a kind of highland fog that hangs like wet cloth. That's when I saw them. 2 men in black suits, standing at the far edge of my property, just past the stone wall, on the rise that overlooks the north field. They weren't moving. They weren't talking. They were both looking straight up at the sky, like they were waiting for something to appear. Even from a distance, something about them looked off. Not just the suits, though that was strange enough out there on a damp hillside, but their stillness. They weren't shifting weight, weren't adjusting their footing, weren't breathing visible clouds of air like I was. Just statues at the edge of the fog. I thought about calling out, but something in my gut told me not to. I busied myself with the feed buckets, kept glancing back. They didn't move an inch. Their faces were hard to make out, but I had the impression of pale skin, dark hair, maybe sunglasses even though the sun hadn't come up fully yet. I tried to ignore them, went about the chores, but every time I looked up, they were still there, staring at the sky. About 10 minutes passed. At one point, I turned my back fully to go into the barn for another sack of feed. When I came out, maybe 30 seconds later, they were gone. No car, no footprints on the damp grass beyond the wall, just empty hillside and rolling fog. I walked to the spot where they'd been, heart thudding. The grass was flattened where someone had clearly been standing, but no sign of how they'd left. I scanned the fields, the lane, even the small road that runs parallel to my land. Nothing. The sheep, which had been restless again while I was inside the barn, had moved to the opposite end of the field and were clustered tightly, facing away from where the men had stood. For the rest of the day, I kept checking that spot. Around noon, I noticed my dog, Baird, wouldn't go near the north field. He's usually fearless, but he stood at the barn door and whined, tail down. Even when I called him, he wouldn't cross the fence line. That night, when the mist rolled back in and the stars came out, I felt the pressure in my ears again. soft and rhythmic, like a pulse underwater. There was nothing in the sky. The sheep stayed huddled by the barn. I stayed inside, lights off, watching through the window for any movement at the edge of the property. For 3 more mornings, I checked the field at dawn. No men in suits, no glow above the trees, but the sheep refused to graze on the north field. They'd step a few paces in and then back away, bunching up like they were avoiding an invisible fence. By the end of the week, I stopped trying to get them back out there. I fenced it off and left it empty. When I stood at the edge of that field alone, it felt like walking into a place where the air was slightly heavier. A quiet pressure you could almost feel against your skin. I didn't see the men again. I still don't know how they got there or where they went. I've had strangers pass through my land before, lost hikers, surveyors, a few kids on bikes, but nothing like that. Nothing like 2 men in black suits staring silently at the sky in the mist. Nothing that leaves a whole field feeling wrong days afterward. Now, whenever I step outside at night, I catch myself glancing at that same tree line, half expecting the glow to return, or for 2 figures to be standing there again, not looking at me, but at something else entirely. It was late November, a cold, damp kind of night where everything smells faintly of wet tarmac and chimney smoke. My girlfriend at the time, Claire, had just moved into a small terrace house near the outskirts of Dundee. I'd been helping her unpack boxes all evening, and by the time we finished, it was after midnight. Her street was one of those short residential ones, with a dead end, old brick houses, narrow pavements, and a single orange streetlight at the corner. We stepped outside to get some air and smoke before heading to bed. It was strangely quiet. Usually you'd hear at least a distant car on the main road or a dog barking, but it was just still. Claire lit her cigarette and nudged me to look up. Over the rooftops, not far above, there was a shape, triangular, perfectly still, no sound. 3 points of white light marked its corners, with a faint red glow in the middle. It wasn't huge, but it was close enough that we could make out the edges, darker than the night sky. The whole thing just hung there, motionless. We whispered to each other without really thinking about why we were whispering. Claire fumbled for her phone, but by the time she unlocked it, the screen stayed black, like the camera wouldn't pick it up. She tried twice, then gave up. As we watched, the red glow at the center pulsed once, then the corner lights blinked. 1, 2, 3, each in turn, like running lights on a stage. It did that twice, then everything went dark. There was no movement when it disappeared, no sudden speed or upward climb. It just wasn't there anymore. We stood there for a while, shivering, staring at the empty sky. Eventually, Claire muttered, "Let's just go inside." Neither of us slept properly that night. We didn't tell anyone, not her neighbors, not our families. We didn't even talk about it much between ourselves after that first night. A week later, we were at the bus stop down by the high street. It was early evening, maybe 6, already dark. It had been drizzling, and the pavement was slick under the streetlights. The stop was empty, except for us. That's when the man walked up. He came from the opposite direction of the main road, hands in the pockets of a black overcoat. Underneath, you could see the edge of a black suit, white shirt, black tie. He wasn't wearing a hat or gloves, even though it was cold. His hair was neatly parted, and he was clean-shaven. He didn't say hello or ask for the time. He stopped a few feet away, looked directly at us, first at Claire, then at me, and asked, very clearly, "Did the lights blink in sequence?" It took me a second to realize what he'd said. Claire blinked at him and opened her mouth, but before she could answer, he turned and walked away. Not quickly, not nervously, just turned and strolled back the way he'd come, his shoes clicking on the wet pavement. He didn't look back. We sat there frozen for a few seconds. The bus came and went without us getting on. When we finally spoke, all Claire said was, "How did he know?" After that, little things started to bother us. One evening, I was leaving Claire's and saw a black car parked at the end of her street. Engine off, windows tinted. The driver's silhouette was barely visible. When I walked toward it, the car started and rolled away slowly, not speeding, just moving off like it had been waiting for something. Claire said her landline rang twice late at night that week, but when she picked up, nobody was there. She thought she heard faint clicking on the other end, like an old tape recorder. Another night, I woke up on her sofa and saw light through the curtains. White, bright, but no sound of an engine. By the time I pulled the curtain back, the street was empty. We never saw the triangular craft again. We didn't see the man again either, not directly. But once, standing at the same bus stop a couple of weeks later, I noticed a tall figure at the far end of the street under a lamp. Black coat, hands in pockets, not moving. When a bus went past and blocked my view for a second, he was gone. I tried to reason it out. Maybe it was some new kind of drone. Maybe the man had overheard us talking somewhere. But it didn't add up. We'd been completely alone when we saw the craft. We hadn't told a soul. The only people who knew were me and Claire, and she swore she hadn't mentioned it to anyone. By January, she moved again, closer to the city center. The car stopped showing up after that. The phone calls stopped too. We never got an explanation for any of it. But whenever I wait for a bus at night now, I catch myself looking over my shoulder, half expecting a man in a black suit to ask me another question I won't know how to answer. I was driving home from a friend's place outside Sterling just after midnight. The roads quiet and slick from a thin mist that had settled over the hills. My headlights cut through the fog in long, narrow beams, and I was just keeping an eye on the bends, trying not to overthink the fact that I had had to swerve around a deer the week before. It was on a long stretch between the village and the outskirts of the city when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a shadow, maybe a fallen branch or a piece of debris, but then it moved, or rather it crossed the road. Slow, deliberate, and completely silent. A black shape, low to the ground, with edges that didn't reflect my lights like a car or a road sign would. I slammed the brakes instinctively, heart pounding, but it didn't move away like an animal would. It just glided across the road in one smooth motion, and then it was gone into the mist on the other side. I sat there for a few minutes, gripping the wheel, thinking I must have imagined it, that my eyes were playing tricks on me. I didn't tell anyone, not my friends, not my partner. Who would believe me? I kept driving, taking it slow the rest of the way home, glancing into the rearview mirror every few seconds. I didn't see anything, but the feeling that I was being watched stayed with me the whole way. 2 nights later, I was in my flat trying to distract myself with a late dinner and the hum of the radiator. The mist was back, crawling along the streets outside. I had just sat down with my plate when there was a knock at the door. Slow, deliberate. I wasn't expecting anyone. Most people who visited me at this hour either rang first or didn't knock at all. When I opened the door, there were 2 men. Black suits, white shirts, black ties, polished shoes that caught the hallway light. Their faces were expressionless, pale in the glow of the porch light. "Good evening," one of them said, his voice even, calm. "Is your vehicle still functioning?" I froze. For a moment, I didn't speak. The question made no sense. My car? It worked fine last I'd checked, and yet the way he said it like he already knew something made my stomach drop. Yes, I managed, my voice higher than normal. They both nodded slightly, nothing else. No explanation, no follow-up. Then the other man, who was shorter, looked me over from head to toe, slowly, as if confirming something. Not in a threatening way, not in a friendly way, just observing. Before I could ask what they meant, they turned, walked down the stairs from my porch, and disappeared into the fog. There was no sound of a car starting, no footsteps fading on the pavement, just gone. I stood there for a long while, gripping the doorframe, my mind racing. Over the next couple of nights, I kept noticing things. The streetlight outside flickered at odd intervals. Shadows that didn't match any object would appear in the corner of my eyes. I swore I heard a car engine start far away, but when I looked, there was nothing on the road. Sometimes I thought I saw dark figures moving behind the mist near the edge of the street, but whenever I went to check, nothing was there. I even started locking the doors and checking windows multiple times a night, the feeling that someone or something was observing me growing heavier. It wasn't terror, exactly, more like unease that burrowed into my chest, like a low vibration you could feel more than hear. The weirdness didn't stop at my flat. On my way to work, I kept noticing black cars in odd places, parked alongside streets, always empty, or at least I never saw anyone inside. They weren't standard models either, older sedans with dark tints that blocked the interior completely. The kind of cars you don't see much anymore. Every time I passed one, my stomach would twist, and I'd speed up without realizing it. I started keeping a log in my phone, trying to write down each time I saw something out of place, but even that felt strange. Sometimes I would scroll back and find entries I didn't remember writing, notes that were in my own words but described times or places I wasn't sure I had been. I thought maybe I was sleepwalking or dozing off at the wheel, but nothing bad had happened. No accidents, no bruises, just disorientation. A week after the knock, I went out to get groceries. On the way back, the mist was heavier than usual, hugging the road. At one point, I swear I saw the same low black shape cross in front of my car again, moving without a sound, slipping between the fog and the headlights like it belonged to a different world. I slammed the brakes, and it vanished. There was no sound, no splash, nothing, like it had never existed. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept staring at my car in the driveway, the outline barely visible in the dim streetlight. I imagined someone standing behind the windows, watching, checking if it still worked. Every creak of the flat, every gust of wind felt like a warning. Eventually, I told myself to stop thinking about it, to just get back to normal. I drove less at night, avoided the roads near where I saw the shape, and tried not to leave the windows open too long. I never saw the men in black again. No knocking, no watching. The black shape didn't return, at least not where I could see it. But the memory lingers. Sometimes, late at night, I'll look at the driveway or glance at the mist rolling over the hills, and I feel that same weight, like someone is checking to see if everything is still in order. And part of me knows that when they asked about my vehicle, it wasn't about the car at all. It was late autumn when it happened. Cold enough that the radiators in my flat clicked and hissed most nights, but not yet winter. I'd been on the local radio a few days earlier, one of those casual call-in segments they run when the news is slow. I only phoned because the host, Graham, was talking about odd things people had seen in the sky. I figured, why not? 2 weeks before that call, I'd seen something strange walking home from the pub. I cut across the park near the canal, and when I looked up, there was this line of lights hanging low and moving slowly. Not a plane. I know what planes look like, and this was too quiet, too close, and the lights weren't in any configuration I recognized. It was like 6 or 7 spheres glowing white, shifting around as if they were connected by something invisible. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds before they tilted and slid off behind the clouds. No sound, no trail, just gone. That was basically what I told Graham on the radio, a short, clumsy description of lights in the sky. Nothing dramatic. He joked about me needing another pint, the usual. I hung up, and that was the end of it, or so I thought. 3 nights later, I heard a knock at my door. It was around 10:30. I wasn't expecting anyone, and I don't usually get visitors that late. At first, I thought maybe it was the downstairs neighbor again complaining about noise, but when I opened the door, there was a man standing there I'd never seen before. He was tall, easily 6'2", and dressed in a black suit with a white shirt buttoned all the way up. No tie, though. His skin was pale, his face narrow, hair dark and combed flat against his head. He looked older than me, maybe early 40s, but it was hard to pin down. What stood out most were his eyes. Not the color, they were a dark brown, but the way he held them on me. Unblinking, fixed, like he wasn't entirely sure how eye contact worked, but was forcing it. "Mr. Harker?" he asked. That's my name, so I nodded. He didn't offer a hand or introduce himself. He just stood there in the doorway until I stepped aside out of politeness. He walked in slowly, like he was measuring each step. I asked what this was about, but he didn't answer right away. He stopped in the middle of the living room, glanced at the books on my shelf, the half-empty glass of water on the table, and at the pile of unopened mail. Then he turned to me and said, very calmly, "You described lights in the sky. I would like to know about the patterns of sound you noticed." The way he said it, it wasn't a question. More like he was reminding me of something. But I hadn't mentioned sound. Not on the radio, not to anyone. The whole point was how quiet the thing had been. I told him that. I said there wasn't any sound. That's what made it so odd. He tilted his head like he didn't quite believe me. No hum, no resonance, Not even a vibration? His words were slow, deliberate, like he'd rehearsed them. Again, I told him no. Just lights. That was it. He stared at me for what felt like too long, then sat down in my armchair without asking. His movements were stiff, like he was imitating how people sit but hadn't practiced much. He folded his hands on his knees and asked me to describe the exact arrangement of the lights. I did my best, but he kept interrupting to ask if they pulsed in sequence, if they overlapped, if the brightness shifted in cycles. Those were his words, pulses and cycles. I started to feel uneasy. He wasn't threatening exactly, but something about the way he focused on these details, especially the ones I hadn't even thought about, made me nervous. He wasn't writing anything down either. No notebook, no phone, nothing. Just sitting there, staring and asking questions. At one point he asked if I'd had any unusual dreams since the sighting. That threw me. I said no, not really, but the truth is I'd been waking up in the middle of the night for no reason, just sitting upright in bed, heart racing, no memory of what I'd been dreaming about. I didn't tell him that. After maybe 20 minutes, he stood up abruptly. No goodbye, no thank you. He just said, if you notice the sounds, you will know what they mean. Then he walked to the door, opened it himself, and stepped into the hallway. I followed him out, more to make sure he was leaving than anything. He went down the stairs slowly, again in that careful, almost mechanical way. I leaned over the railing, and by the time he reached the bottom, I expected to hear the front door open. But there was nothing. No creak of the hinges, no slam, just silence. I waited a full minute, then went down after him. The entryway was empty. The street outside was quiet, just one car parked under the lamp. No sign of him walking away. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the conversation in my head, especially that line, the patterns of sound. It was like he knew something I didn't. The more I thought about it, the more I wondered if maybe there had been a sound that night in the park, something too faint for me to register. Or maybe he was planting the idea in my head on purpose. The strangest part came a week later. I was brushing my teeth with the bathroom window cracked open when I heard this low, steady hum. At first, I thought it was the boiler or maybe traffic from the main road, but it wasn't. It was deeper, more even, almost like standing next to an electric transformer, except it was coming from outside, not inside. I turned off the tap and just stood there, listening. The hum went on for maybe a minute, then faded out completely. I ran to the window and looked down at the street. Nothing unusual. Just the same cars, the same empty pavement. I never saw the man again. I was working nights at the time, a floor nurse at St. Cuthbert's, a small regional hospital outside Manchester. This was about 6 years ago. We weren't a big facility, so it was rare that we got anything unusual, mostly older folks with falls, respiratory issues, the usual emergencies. That night started like any other. Around 1:30 in the morning, paramedics brought in a man from a village about 15 miles north. His name was Alan Webster. He was maybe late 30s, wiry build, still in muddy boots and a jacket that smelled faintly of wood smoke. He'd collapsed in a field, according to the report, after calling emergency services himself. He'd been out walking his dog when it happened. His vitals were stable, but he was pale, shaking, and repeating the same thing over and over. It was right above me. I couldn't move. The lights were everywhere. I remember the paramedic rolling his eyes when he said it, muttering something about too much late-night telly. Still, Alan was frightened enough that we admitted him overnight for observation. I was the one who settled him in. He kept trying to sit up in bed, craning his neck toward the window like he expected something to still be there. His dog apparently had bolted and hadn't come back yet. When I asked what he'd seen, he said it was like a disc of light circling silently over the tree line. No sound at all. That's the worst of it, he kept saying. His words were slurred, like he was coming out of a faint. He claimed he'd blacked out when the thing moved directly overhead, and when he came to, he couldn't feel his hands for a minute. I noted everything, same as I would for chest pain or a fall, though part of me chalked it up to stress and maybe dehydration. It wasn't my job to judge what he believed he'd seen. Around 3 a.m., I was at the nurse's station finishing charting when 2 men walked in through the ward's main doors. That caught my attention immediately because at that hour we lock everything down. Visitors aren't supposed to come through without buzzing at the front desk downstairs. I didn't hear any buzzer. Both men wore black suits. Not expensive looking, not tailored, just standard. White shirts, black ties, polished shoes. One was shorter, bald, with very pale skin. The other taller, dark hair slicked back, maybe early 40s. What unsettled me first was how they moved. Their pace was steady, synchronized almost, no wasted motion. They walked straight to the desk without looking around. The shorter one asked in a very flat tone, "Where is Mr. Alan Webster?" I hesitated. Normally, we don't give out patient information without checking credentials. They didn't offer any ID, just stood there, both pairs of eyes fixed on me like they were waiting for a programmed response. I asked who they were with. "Administration," the taller one said. His voice was calm, but his accent was off. Not local, not even clearly British. It was like he'd learned the words phonetically. I said visiting hours were over. The shorter one leaned closer, resting both hands on the desk. His fingernails were oddly smooth like plastic. "We need to speak with Mr. Webster now." Something about the way he said "need" made my stomach twist. Against my better judgment, I told them his room number but added that I'd need to check with the charge nurse before letting them in. They didn't wait. They walked past me down the hall, their shoes clicking in unison. I got up and followed, trying to think what to say. By the time I reached Alan's room, the door was already shut. Through the glass panel, I saw them standing on either side of his bed. Alan looked wide awake, eyes darting between them. His mouth moved rapidly, though I couldn't hear the words. One of the men had a small notepad in his hand, but wasn't writing anything. I tapped on the door, but neither of them turned. Alan did, just for a split second, eyes locking on mine. He looked terrified. Then, the taller man leaned in and said something, and Alan's face went blank again. They stayed with him for maybe 10 minutes. When they came out, I stepped forward to ask for ID. The taller one looked at me directly and said, "He has been discharged." No paperwork, no consult, nothing. Just those words. I hurried into the room as they walked away. Alan's bed was empty. The sheets were pulled back, but there was no sign of him. Not in the bathroom, not in the hallway. His clothes and boots were gone, too. I spun around, ready to chase after the two men, but the corridor was empty. Completely. I ran all the way to the stairwell and down to the lobby. No sign of them. Security swore no one had come through the front doors in the last half hour. By morning, things got worse. I went to update Alan's chart and found his admission record had disappeared from the system. No file, no wristband, nothing. When I asked IT, they said the patient number I gave them didn't exist. The paramedics who'd brought him in denied having transported anyone by that name. I checked the incident book myself. Sure enough, the entry I'd written at 1:45 a.m., Alan Webster, collapse outdoors, possible faint, was missing. Torn out cleanly, not even a scrap left behind. When I asked around with the other nurses, a few remembered him, but most acted like I was mixing him up with another case. Only Claire, one of the night aides, quietly told me she'd seen the two men leave his room. She said Alan was walking between them, unsteady, almost like he was sleepwalking. But when we checked the CCTV feed from the ward corridor, there was a gap. 15 minutes of blank footage exactly covering the time they'd been there. No one filed a discharge. No doctor signed off. Officially, Alan Webster was never admitted. That was the end of it, at least on paper. But for weeks afterward, I noticed little things. The stairwell light on my floor would flicker only when I was alone. The automatic doors at the front sometimes opened for no reason at 3 or 4 a.m. And once, leaving my shift near dawn, I saw a black sedan idling across the street, windows tinted. When I turned to look directly at it, it drove away slowly without turning on its headlights. I never saw Alan again. I was out on Loch Rannoch late one August evening, just after the sun had dropped behind the hills. The sky was clear, the water black with small ripples catching the last glints of light. I'd been fishing that area for years. Nothing special, just hoping to get a trout or two for dinner. I wasn't expecting anything unusual. I remember casting my line near the far side of the dock when the water below started moving in a way that didn't make sense. Not ripples from wind or a fish, something deeper. A soft glow appeared under the surface, shifting slowly like it was following some pattern beneath the lock. At first, I thought it might be an optical trick, the reflection of a distant lighthouse or a boat light, but there wasn't anything out there. The glow kept moving, slow and steady, and I noticed it would circle in almost perfect arcs, sometimes disappearing, sometimes returning a few feet over. I fished longer than I meant to, just staring, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Eventually, I packed up, shaking my head. I didn't call anyone, I didn't write it down, I didn't even tell my neighbor, who occasionally fished with me. It was one of those things you file away in the back of your mind, unsure if it even happened. The next morning, I was at the dock early, cleaning my nets, when I noticed a black car parked at the far end. It wasn't just any car. It looked old, like a 90s model sedan, completely black, with tinted windows that seemed darker than usual. My first thought was some city tourists or someone delivering supplies. Then two men got out. Black suits, white shirts, black ties, shoes that gleamed as if polished that morning. They didn't wave, didn't smile, just walked directly toward me. The air felt heavier as they approached. I froze halfway through a motion of brushing the nets. The taller one spoke first. His voice was calm, almost flat. "How many times have you seen the movement?" I blinked, unsure if he meant the fishing line or something else. "Movement?" I said. He nodded once, sharply. "The movement under the water. How many times?" I froze. I hadn't told anyone about last night. No neighbors, no radio call-ins, no friends. No one knew I'd seen anything, and yet here they were, asking about it. I don't understand," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. "What movement?" The shorter man stepped closer, looking at me steadily. His eyes were gray, like ash. "You know. The pattern, the light. How many times?" I swallowed. I only saw it once," I finally said, though even saying it aloud made it feel wrong. The taller man exchanged a glance with him. It was so fast I almost missed it, but there was something there. Confusion, maybe disbelief, or something else I couldn't put a name to. They didn't say anything else. Just turned and walked back toward the car, moving with a kind of precision that didn't match human gait. I watched them get in, but neither opened a door fully before sitting down. The car didn't make any sound starting, just slid into the gravel like it was a part of the morning mist. And then it was gone, like it had never been there. I spent the rest of the day trying to shake it off. I told myself I imagined it, that the tension from being alone on the lock at night had messed with me. But later, when I checked the dock, there were no footprints where they'd stood. The gravel was undisturbed, no tire tracks from the car. It was clean, like nothing had been there at all. That evening, I went back to the lock to check the water. Nothing. The surface was smooth, black, quiet. But I felt watched, like I wasn't supposed to be there. I packed up early and walked back to my small cabin on the hill, scanning the tree line for movement. I didn't see anyone, but I kept glancing, half expecting to catch a flash of a suit or the reflection of a watch face. For the next few nights, I kept seeing shadows near the edge of the dock when I looked out my window, but every time I stepped outside, they were gone. No car, no people, nothing. And the lock seemed different somehow, quieter, heavier, like it held its breath. I haven't gone back to that part of the lock since. I still fish the Rannoch area, but not there, not at that dock. And I haven't told anyone what happened. There's no proof, nothing to show, just the memory of two men who knew something I never said, who disappeared like they were never real. I've thought about it every now and then, the way they asked about the movement, the way they looked at each other after I said once. It was precise, methodical, like they were checking a record I didn't know existed. Some nights, when the wind is right and the lock is dark, I imagine them walking up the hill toward my cabin again. And part of me wants to see if they come back just to get answers. But another part knows I don't want to find out. So I keep quiet, watch the lock from the edge of the hill when I can, and let the memory sit there, quiet, like the surface of that water I'll never fish near again. It was late September, about 10 years ago, when this happened. I was living in a small village outside of Inverurie in Aberdeenshire. Quiet place, farmland all around, maybe 2 shops and a pub. Nights there were still dark in the way they rarely are anymore. No streetlights passed the main road, and if the sky was clear, you could see the stars without interruption. One night I was walking home from a friend's house just after 11. The air was sharp with that early autumn bite, and the fields were heavy with the smell of cut silage. I remember I was looking down most of the walk, keeping my torch on the dirt path so I didn't trip on ruts. When I finally looked up, I saw it. Above me, maybe just over the tree line, there was a shape blocking out part of the stars. At first I thought it was a cloud, except it was too precise, 3 straight edges forming a triangle. I stopped walking and just stood there. It moved slowly, silently, like it was gliding. No sound of engines, not even the rustle of branches that a low-flying plane sometimes causes. The edges were faintly outlined by 3 lights, one at each corner, white and steady, not blinking. It passed directly overhead, taking maybe 20 seconds. Then it continued on toward the hills and eventually blended back into the dark. I didn't run home or anything like that, but I remember feeling frozen, like my body didn't know what to do. When I got inside, I didn't mention it to anyone, not even my wife. I told myself I'd seen some kind of military plane, though I'd never seen anything move like that. I barely slept that night, replaying it in my head. The next day, I was walking to the shop in the late morning. Bright day, sky washed clean after rain, the streets damp. I was halfway down the lane near the old church when a man stepped out from around the corner. He was tall, dressed in a black suit, white shirt, thin black tie. Not unusual in itself, except this was a village where you almost never saw someone dressed like that unless it was Sunday service or a funeral. He stopped directly in my path. His skin was pale, eyes dark, and his face had this odd stillness to it. No twitch, no blink, no normal little movements people usually have when they're standing there. He looked at me and said, in a calm but strange voice, "Did the craft rotate?" It wasn't a question I understood right away. My stomach dropped. I hadn't told a soul what I'd seen, and I hadn't used the word craft in my own head. I asked him what he meant. He repeated the question, exactly the same tone. Did the craft rotate? I told him no, it hadn't. It had just glided, flat. I realized as I said it that I'd admitted too much, that I'd seen something at all. He nodded once, as though I'd confirmed something for him. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away down the narrow side street by the church. I waited a few seconds and then followed, because the whole encounter was too strange to just let happen without some kind of explanation. When I turned the corner, the lane was empty. I walked it all the way to the end. It came out onto a field with no cars, no gates open, nowhere he could have gone in that amount of time. I stood there for a while, scanning the hedges, listening for footsteps. Nothing, just the sound of crows on the wires and the smell of wet earth. That night, I tried again to explain it away. Maybe he was someone passing through, maybe it was coincidence. But the exact phrasing, "Did the craft rotate?" stuck with me. I hadn't fully thought of what I saw as a craft until he said it. Over the next week, small things made me uneasy. My dog, usually calm, barked at the back garden gate 3 nights in a row, always around the same hour, just before 2 a.m. When I went out to look, the lane was empty. Once, I thought I saw a car idling at the edge of the field past our house. Black or dark gray, lights off. By the time I grabbed my torch, it was gone. I never saw the suited man again. He didn't show up in the village, and no one else mentioned noticing a stranger dressed like that. But I couldn't shake the memory of him asking about rotation, as if that detail mattered more than anything else. I still don't know what I saw that night or how he knew I'd seen it. We'd gone up to Loch 80 for a weekend camping trip. My girlfriend at the time, Laura, had just bought new gear and wanted to test it out before autumn set in. It was late August, warm during the day, but cold enough at night that you wanted a decent sleeping bag. We found a spot off a forestry track on the north side, a flat bit of ground just up from the water with a clear view across the loch. No other campers in sight, only a farmhouse in the distance with its lights faint against the trees. It was quiet, the kind of quiet where you hear every ripple on the water and every branch shifting overhead. That night after dinner, we sat by the water's edge, just listening. Around 11, when it was fully dark, Laura noticed something first. "Look," she said, pointing out across the loch. At first, I thought it was just a reflection of a star, but then it moved. slowly, deliberately. A sphere of light, pale yellow, about the size of a lantern, hovering maybe 100 feet above the surface. Another appeared beside it, then a third, and they kept perfect distance from each other. They didn't blink like plane lights. They didn't cast beams like a torch or boat lamp. They just glowed, steady, with this strange pulsing quality that made the water shimmer below them. We didn't speak much, just sat there frozen, watching. They drifted from one side of the loch to the other without making a sound. Once they lowered closer to the surface and the reflection doubled itself. 3 spheres above, 3 on the water, moving together. After maybe 15 minutes, they rose higher, faded, and were gone. No trail, no noise, just darkness again. We went back to the tent without saying much. I remember lying there, listening harder than I ever had in my life, half convinced I'd hear something approach through the trees. But all I caught was the occasional splash of a fish or the wind brushing through the heather. In the morning, I was unzipping the tent flap when I realized 2 men were standing about 10 feet away. Both wore dark suits, black ties, white shirts. Their clothes looked wrong for where we were, creased but dry, like they hadn't hiked through mud or brush to get there. They didn't smile or introduce themselves. One of them, taller, with very short dark hair, asked, "Did you hear the hum?" It froze me. I hadn't told anyone what we'd seen, not even Laura's brother, who knew where we'd camped. And we hadn't said a word to each other about sound, because there hadn't been any. Laura sat up behind me, rubbing her eyes, and asked what he meant. The second man, lighter hair, no expression, repeated the same thing. "The hum. Did you hear it?" We said no, that we hadn't heard anything. They both looked at each other, just a flicker of a glance, like they were confirming something silently. Then the tall one said, "Thank you." And without another word, they turned and walked back up the forestry track. We sat there stunned. I didn't even think to grab my boots and follow until they were out of sight. When I finally went up the track, it was empty. No car sounds, no footprints in the soft mud, nothing. Later that day, when we packed up, Laura pointed out that the sheep in the field by the farmhouse were all crowded on one side, pressed tight against the fence, like they were trying to get as far from the loch as possible. Driving home, we tried to talk about it, but it felt strange, like saying too much out loud might make it worse. The only detail that stuck in my head over and over was how certain they'd been that we'd heard something, that hum. We never camped at Ative again. We hadn't planned on seeing anything unusual that night. My wife, Marissa, and I had just driven out to her sister's place in Oak Ridge for dinner, and we left a little after 9. The drive home was about 40 minutes of mostly dark back roads lined with trees and the occasional pasture. It was early October, so the air had that cool bite to it, and the sky was unusually clear. About halfway home near a stretch of farmland, Marissa spotted something first. She pointed out the passenger window and said, "Look at that." Hovering low above a row of trees, maybe a couple 100 yards off the road, was a cluster of lights. At first, I thought it was a plane, but the pattern didn't make sense. They weren't blinking like aircraft lights. They glowed steady, 3 white, 1 red, arranged in a kind of diamond shape. The strangest part was how still they were. We slowed down, then stopped the car on the shoulder to get a better look. The object just hung there, completely silent. It wasn't like a helicopter either. No rotor sound, no vibration in the air. The lights shifted slowly, almost like it rotated, and then it began to drift sideways, parallel to the tree line. We sat there maybe 2 minutes, just watching it, until it suddenly rose up, fast, unnaturally fast, and disappeared into the sky without a sound. Neither of us spoke much after that. We got back on the road and drove home in this weird silence, both of us glancing out the windows like we expected it to come back. I kept replaying it in my head, trying to make it fit into something ordinary, and it just didn't. When we turned onto our street, the sight of our house should have been comforting. But the second the headlights swung across the front yard, I saw them. 2 men standing at our door. They were dressed in dark suits, both of them tall and thin. Their skin looked oddly pale in the headlights, almost gray. Neither of them turned to look at the car pulling up, which struck me right away as strange. Most people would. Instead, they just stood there, motionless, facing our front door like they'd been waiting. Marissa grabbed my arm and whispered, "Who are they?" I pulled into the driveway slower than usual, like my brain was trying to catch up. We hadn't told anyone about what we'd just seen. We hadn't even spoken about it to each other, and yet, here were these two men already waiting at our house. We parked, and before either of us could get out, both men turned in perfect unison and started walking toward us. Their movements were stiff but deliberate, like they were mimicking how people are supposed to walk. I rolled the window down halfway as they approached. One of them leaned slightly toward the window. His eyes looked dark, too dark, and his expression never changed. In a flat, almost mechanical voice, he asked, "Did you see it land?" That was the only thing he said. Marissa and I just stared at him. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. The way he phrased it made my stomach twist, like they already knew exactly what we had seen and that they were confirming some detail. Finally, Marissa answered. "No," she said quietly. The man stared at her for a moment, then straightened up. He glanced at the other man who hadn't moved or spoken. Then, without another word, they both turned and walked down the driveway. Not hurried, not slow, just steady, like they were following some script. I thought maybe they had a car parked on the street, but when they reached the end of the drive, they didn't cross the road. They didn't head toward a vehicle. They just kept walking, side by side, until the dark swallowed them up past the streetlight. We sat there in the car for a long time. Neither of us wanted to get out. When we finally did, I looked around, half expecting to see them standing in the yard again, but it was empty. That night, neither of us slept much. Every little sound outside made us sit up and listen. Around 3 in the morning, I got up and checked the locks again. Nothing had been touched, but it still felt like the air in the house was heavy, like we weren't alone. The next day, I asked our neighbors if they'd seen anyone on our street. No one had. I even drove up and down the road to see if there had been a car parked somewhere I missed, but there was nothing. The part I can't shake is how specific the question was. Not, "Did you see something?" or "Did you see the lights?" It was, "Did you see it land?" Almost like they knew exactly what we'd been watching and only needed to confirm whether we'd seen the end of it. And the way they left, no car, no sound, no trace, still makes no sense to me. The ferry ride back from St. George's was supposed to be uneventful. It was late July, warm, but with that cool salt air rolling in off the Atlantic, and the sky was still pale blue when we left the dock. I'd been out on the eastern cliffs earlier that evening, just me and my phone, taking videos of the gulls and the waves hitting the rocks. That's when I saw the lights. They were low over the water, maybe half a mile offshore. 3 of them at first, white but with a tinge of green, drifting together like they were tethered. I thought maybe it was helicopters, but there was no sound. The longer I watched, the more they shifted, splitting apart and then sliding back into a triangle. I filmed for as long as I could, zooming in until the image went grainy, and then the lights blinked out all at once. Just gone. I figured I'd look at the footage later, but the ferry was leaving soon and I didn't want to miss it. I boarded like usual, handed my ticket to the deckhand, and went to the back rail to watch the wake. There were maybe 20 other passengers, a mix of commuters and tourists. Everyone had that quiet, tired look you see on evening boats. As we pulled away from the dock, I noticed 2 men sitting near the rear cabin window, facing the water. They were dressed alike, dark suits, white shirts, black ties. Not exactly common on a ferry this late, especially in summer. No one around here wears suits unless it's a wedding or a funeral. Both had hats set neatly on the seat beside them. They weren't talking to each other or anyone else, just sitting perfectly still. At first, I didn't think much of it, but something about them didn't sit right. They weren't scrolling on their phones, weren't glancing around, weren't shifting in their seats like normal passengers. They just stared out at the ocean. I tried to remember if I'd seen them board. I hadn't. I'd been standing near the gangway when they loaded the cars and foot traffic. I could have missed them, sure, but the image of the 2 empty seats by that window was fresh in my head. Half an hour in, I went inside to use the restroom. On the way back, I slowed near their table. Up close, they looked odd. Both were tall and pale, with dark hair combed straight back, no parting. They're smooth, like they'd been airbrushed. The shorter one had his hands folded on the table, long, thin fingers, perfectly still. Neither blinked while I walked past. I took a seat a few rows behind them. For the rest of the crossing, I kept sneaking looks. Once, the taller one turned his head just enough that I could see his profile. His jaw barely moved, but I swear his lips formed a word. I couldn't hear it. The other one tilted his head almost imperceptibly, like he was listening. Nobody else seemed to notice them. A woman with 2 kids walked right by to get snacks. She didn't glance at them at all. When the ferry horn sounded as we neared the dock, both men straightened at the same time, like soldiers coming to attention. We disembarked a few minutes later. I went down the gangway, glanced back, and saw their table was empty. Their hats were gone too. I lingered on the pier, pretending to tie my shoe, and watched the other passengers file off. No suits, just the usual. Fishermen, a few teenagers with bikes, a couple holding hands. No sign of the men. When the last car drove off, I walked back up the dock and looked through the ferry windows. Their booth was still empty. Nobody on deck either. The footage of the lights is still on my phone. It's grainy, shaky, but the shapes are there. I've watched it dozens of times, trying to figure out what I saw. I can't shake the image of those 2 men, though. How they were just suddenly there, staring out at the same ocean where the lights had been, and then gone before anyone noticed. It was late autumn, gray skies most days, the kind of damp chill that seeps through your jacket, no matter how many layers you've got on. I'd been working my family's farm outside Stirlingshire, same as I had since I was old enough to drive a tractor. Sheep mostly, some barley. It wasn't glamorous, but it was quiet and it was mine. The first odd thing happened just after dusk one Wednesday. I'd been closing up the shed and noticed a strange brightness on the far end of the north pasture. At first I thought it was the moon breaking through the clouds, but when I looked properly, it wasn't like any moonlight I'd seen. It was 3 distinct lights hanging above the field in a tight triangle. They shifted around almost lazily, but stayed perfectly even with one another. There was no sound, no engine, no hum, just this eerie glow moving silently over the pasture. I stood watching for maybe 10 minutes, heart thudding, until the lights rose in unison and shot upward, vanishing into the low clouds without a trace. That night, I didn't sleep well. Kept replaying it, trying to think of some normal explanation. By morning, I'd convinced myself it was maybe some kind of military exercise. I called the RAF base not far from us and reported what I'd seen. The man on the line sounded polite enough, but didn't ask many questions, just noted the time and location and said, "Thank you, sir." That was it. The following afternoon, around 3, I was in the yard splitting wood when a black car came down the lane. Old model, looked polished but out of place on our muddy track. 2 men stepped out, both tall, both wearing dark suits and hats. They didn't look like anyone from the base. Their clothes seemed too sharp, too clean, considering where they were. One of them, the taller one, spoke first. His accent was strange, hard to place. Not English, not Scottish either. "We'd like to see where you keep your sheep," he said flatly. It wasn't a request, more like a statement, as if I'd already agreed. I remember being thrown off by how pale both of them looked, like they hadn't seen the sun in years. Their faces were smooth, almost waxy, and they blinked far less often than normal. I hesitated, but I didn't feel like saying no. Something about the way they stood there, silent, waiting, made me uneasy. So I led them across the yard, through the gate, and toward the south paddock, where most of the flock was grazing. They didn't ask me anything along the way. They just followed, their shoes hardly making a sound on the gravel. When we reached the fence, the shorter one leaned on the post and stared at the sheep for a long while. The taller one turned his head toward me and said, "This is all of them?" "Most," I answered. My voice sounded small. They both nodded at the same time, a slow, synchronized movement that made my stomach knot. Then they turned without another word and walked back toward the car. I didn't follow right away, just stood there by the fence, gripping the wood. By the time I caught up, they were already in the car. The engine started with a low purr, and they drove back up the lane without looking at me once. That evening, The sheep behaved oddly. Normally, they'd crowd the south paddock until I guided them back toward the sheds, but that night they refused to go near it. They bunched together by the gate, bleating, stamping their hooves, refusing to move no matter how much I coaxed. In the end, I herded them into the smaller east field instead. I figured it was just animals being unpredictable, but it kept happening. Every night after, they avoided the south paddock like there was something wrong with it. Even during the day, they stayed away, huddled at the far edge if they wandered in at all. A week later, I walked the field myself, trying to spot anything out of place. The grass looked normal, no scorch marks, no broken fences, just the same pasture I'd tended for years. But standing there, I felt a strange heaviness, like the air itself was pressing down. I can't explain it better than that. Since then, I haven't seen the men again, haven't seen the lights either. But the sheep still won't settle in that field. It's as if they know something's there that I don't. I was almost at the corner when it started following me. It was a Tuesday in October, the kind of cold that doesn't bite but makes your skin feel tight. School let out at 3 and I missed the bus because my algebra test took longer than it should have. I decided to walk the half-mile home. The street was the usual, cars parked nose to curb, Mrs. Ortega's dog tied to the porch rail, kids' bikes leaning against steps. I had my headphones in for 20 seconds and then took them out because I'm weird about hearing the world when I walk alone. At first, it was a light on the power lines. You know that spill of light near the old water tower, one bulb that thinks it's a spotlight. But the shape didn't sit on the pole. It hung in the air about 20 feet above the sidewalk, right past the library steps. A pale circle, like a paper plate with a glow on it. No halo, no beam, just that soft, steady disc. I stopped. My hands were in my hoodie pockets, and my breath made small clouds. The light didn't flicker. It didn't hum. The leaves above me didn't move when it slid a little to the left. It followed the street with me. When I crossed at the crosswalk, it crossed too, keeping the same distance, as if it was paired with me like a shadow. I know that sounds dramatic, but that's exactly what it felt like. A kid named TJ from my homeroom walked past with his skateboard and didn't even glance up. He treated the light like a lamppost, which made everything worse because if a bunch of people had seen it and ignored it, what was it? I thought about taking a picture, but my phone's camera was open to text messages, and the screen looked like junk shots of sky. It never shows these things, right? I kept moving. The light drifted closer like a polite drone. When the cul-de-sac around my block hits the hill, my neighborhood opens to a line of trees and then our houses. The light slowed and then stopped right above the sidewalk near Mr. Levin's garage. I could see through it a little, like fog around a lamp. Then it shot ahead like someone tugged it. Not a burst, just a quick motion. And I suddenly had this stupid hot panic feeling. Like when you're 10 and you think you forgot to lock the shed and your dad will know. I jogged the rest of the way. I didn't look back until I was almost inside. I told myself out loud, like a joke, it followed me home. Claire from across the street heard me and asked if I was okay. I said I was fine and closed the door. Inside, I locked it, flipped the porch light, and told my mom in the kitchen. She was drying dishes and she smiled like moms do when their kid says something weird and insists it was serious. "You got home safe," she said. "Good." I didn't tell anyone the shape. I don't know why. I just said, "a light," and left the rest out because it sounded silly, like something out of a movie. Mom didn't ask more. She had the oven on and a work call in an hour. My brother called from college and told me one of his friends had caught the bus upstate. I went to my room and lay on my bed, and the ceiling looked the same as it always did, and the light feeling in my gut didn't go away. The next morning, I went to school early because I wanted to ask Mr. Hargrove about the test. The front steps were wet from a fog that had rolled in overnight. 2 men were standing by the flagpole when I got there. They were the kind of men you only see in movies about suits and secrets. Dark suits, dark ties, shoes so polished they flashed the concrete. They didn't have badges or anything. They looked like they were waiting for someone. One of them saw me and tilted his head like I was exactly what he expected to find. He walked over with the other man and stopped about 3 feet from me. The taller one had a face that didn't register much. The other had a small scar on his cheek. They smelled faintly of something like hospital lemon cleaner. I felt a stupid, childish urge to say, "Can I help you?" Because that's how your brain handles strangers on your school grounds. The taller man said, "Good morning. We're following up on an observation. Did the sphere follow you again last night?" The words landed flat and heavy. "Sphere?" I said, because I hadn't told anyone it was a sphere. I had literally said, "a light." My tongue felt thick. People had told me to be honest about things you're not sure about, but being honest right then seemed like an invitation. The shorter man watched me. He didn't write anything down. He looked bored and not bored, which is a quiet kind of attention that made my skin tingle. "Describe its motion and color," he said. "Were there any sounds, any interference with electronics?" I could have lied. I could have made a joke and walked away. I didn't. I wanted, for some reason, to see what they'd do with my answer. "It followed me from the library," I said. "It was pale, like a white with a hint of blue. It moved slow, mostly. Then it made a fast slide to the curb. No sound. My phone went a little fuzzy when I opened the camera." I didn't say I'd thought about the test, about being late, about everything that might have made my head buzzy. Both men exchanged a small look like they were reading lines from the same page. The taller one said, "Thank you. Continue your routine. Avoid sharing the observation. Keep to usual channels. Report any physiological symptoms." "Report to who?" I asked, because I wasn't sure which authority he'd meant. "School nurse? Police?" He didn't answer. The shorter man added, "If it follows again, maintain distance and do not attempt to interact." They turned and walked away without another word. Nobody at the school seemed to notice. The janitor, who always waffles close to his cigarette, was sweeping the covered walkway and ignored them. The secretary, Miss Patel, buzzed through double doors and said "good morning" on autopilot and didn't look twice. It was like whatever they'd been doing at the flagpole was an invisible errand in a visible place. I spent the day acting normal. I answered questions, took notes, handed back a worksheet. But I watched the edges of everything. Hallway light fixtures, the way fluorescent hums on a bad bulb seem louder when you know something's off. At lunch, TJ asked if I'd seen the news about a traffic accident on Route 9. I said I had not, and then he mentioned an odd translator error in the feed, and by the time the bell rang, it felt like a dozen small things were rattling loose in my head. That night, because I didn't sleep well, I walked to the corner and stood with my hands in my pockets and looked up at the sky. The air smelled of wet asphalt and the neighbor's grill. No lights, no disc. Gus, Mrs. Ortega's dog, trotted by with his owner and gave me a look like he'd expected me to be inside because that's where people stay after dark. I went home and left the porch light on anyway. In the days after the men came, small things that used to be background noise started feeling like signals. My phone's alarm blinked a minute early, then corrected itself. The school security camera that faces the parking lot recorded a 15-second clip of the morning the men were there, and then, in the middle of the footage, the file showed nothing but static for 2 frames and then resumed. My friend Maya, who sits behind me in history, said she hadn't remembered me telling Mr. Hargrove about the test, though I'd literally told him 3 separate times that morning. It was like facts were sliding into and out of place around me. A week later, on a rainy Thursday, I was called down to the office. I thought I was in trouble for something dumb, texting, skipping the locker, whatever. But the principal asked me to sit, and the 2 men were there again, sitting in folding chairs like they'd been there forever. The taller one smiled the same thin smile as before. "We just want to ensure you're coping," the principal said. "Any headaches? Sleep issues? Dizziness?" It felt like a medical intake. I told them I'd been tired and jumpy. I didn't mention the second night I'd gone out just to look, or the way my hands trembled when I reached for a pen. The men didn't ask for the photos on my phone. They didn't ask to see the route I'd walked. They nodded and left. The principal told me to visit the nurse if I needed to. I tried to move on. I ran errands for my mom. I did my homework. I went to soccer practice. Normal things. But the light kept visiting my thoughts. On the 3rd night after they'd spoken to me at school, I woke up to the sound of a car door outside and the feeling that someone was watching the house. The porch light was on, and there was no one there when I pulled back the curtains. The silence the next morning felt like someone had taken a chorus of birds away. I never saw the men again. Not in person. I saw a black sedan twice in the distance on the bypass, stationary where a driver wouldn't normally sit. I kept the shape of the light to myself. I told my brother I'd seen something weird and left it at that because people will either make a hero out of you or a liar, and I didn't need either. It is strange how ordinary things begin to feel keyed to an event. I found myself checking my phone camera when I passed the library now, not to get proof, but because the act of checking made me feel safer. My hands would go to my pockets a little faster on the walk home. Once, when I waited for the crosswalk and the light up by the tower blinked, I felt that old, small panic flare and then go out again like a candle. Time kept moving. Classes changed, seasons changed. The light, whatever the heck it was, hasn't followed me since that first night. Maybe it wanted something, and it got it. Maybe it wanted nothing at all. The men in suits never called, never sent a letter, never showed up again. The school carried on, the janitor swept. My phone's camera still shows lousy photos of the sky. I tell this because sometimes the strange thing is not the big mythic moment. Sometimes it's the tiny enrollment of details after the fact, a question asked in a neutral tone by someone who already seems to know the answer, a blank frame on a security file, a neighbor's dog that doesn't bark where it used to. That's what made me watch the sky for a while longer than I should have. It's what made me lock the door twice at night, which is a habit I've kept. It was the end of August, hot even after dark, and the cicadas were still going. I'd pulled my car off County Road 14 onto the gravel shoulder near a big cornfield. The stalks were taller than me, thick and dark in the humid air. I'm a freelance photographer and had been out in the area earlier shooting barns for a client. On the drive back, I noticed odd lights low over the field. 3 of them at first, white but soft, almost like lanterns drifting above the corn. They weren't moving like planes or drones. They hovered, shifted slightly, then lined up again. I parked and killed the headlights. The sky was a dull orange from distant town glow, a few stars visible. I set up my camera on the hood and started taking shots at different exposures. Through the viewfinder, the lights looked sharper, almost brighter than they did to my eyes. I took maybe a dozen photos. At one point, the lights faded, then came back in a completely different position. There was no sound except insects and the faint buzz of the power lines running along the road. It felt strange, but not threatening. Just weird. After about 15 minutes, the lights blinked out altogether. I waited a while, then decided to head home. That's when I saw them. 2 men were standing by the rear of my car, near the trunk. Black suits, white shirts, black ties. Their suits were heavy-looking, like something you'd wear to a winter funeral, but neither of them seemed sweaty despite the heat. They were tall, one taller than me by at least half a foot, the other only a little shorter. Both wore black shoes that were completely clean despite the dusty gravel. I didn't hear them walk up. One second I was fiddling with my camera settings, the next they were just there. "Evening, ma'am," the taller one said. His voice was low and even, not loud enough for the open field. "We'd like to see the camera you used." I gripped the camera tighter and asked who they were. They didn't answer. The shorter one repeated the same line, word for word, same tone. "We'd like to see the camera you used." There was something about the way they said it, like they were reading a script or a line of code. No accent, no inflection. I said, "Why?" Neither of them spoke for a full 5 seconds. They just stared. Their faces were pale but not sickly, they were smooth in a way that made it hard to guess their ages. Their hair was dark, parted on the side, cut short like an old photo. The taller one's lips barely moved when he finally said, "To verify." That was all. I stepped back toward the driver's door. "I'm not giving you my camera." They both smiled at the exact same moment. Same small upturn at the corners, same flash of perfectly even teeth. It wasn't a normal smile. It looked rehearsed, like someone copying a picture of a smile. Then, without another word, they turned at the same time and started walking down the road in the opposite direction. No car, no flashlight, nothing. Just the black suits and the pale faces in the humid dark. I stood frozen by my car. the camera still in my hands. The gravel crunched under their shoes for a few seconds, then even that stopped. When I looked up again, they were gone. The road stretched straight for a long distance. There was nowhere for them to have turned off. I got in the car, locked the doors, and started the engine. My hands were trembling enough that I dropped the camera on the passenger seat instead of putting it in its bag. Driving back toward town, my radio went to static for about a mile, then returned to normal. The dash clock flickered once, then settled back to the correct time. I kept checking the rearview mirror, but saw only empty road. At home, I went straight to my laptop and loaded the photos. The first few were normal, dim shapes of the cornfield, some faint glows where the lights had been. Then, halfway through the sequence, one shot showed the two men. Not by my car, but out in the cornfield between the rows, facing the camera. They were blurry, but clearly them. Black suits in the middle of the stalks, looking straight at me. I hadn't seen anyone in the field while I was shooting. There'd been no movement, no sound of rustling leaves. In the next shot, they were gone, just empty rows of corn. I shut the laptop and walked around my house, turning on every light. It was after midnight by then. Outside was silent except for the crickets. 2 days later, while I was at the grocery store, my phone buzzed with a text notification from an unknown number. It was just a photo, the same one I'd taken of the two men in the cornfield, but zoomed in on their faces. No message, no caption, my own photo, sent to me. When I got home, the camera battery was dead, though it had been full the night before. The memory card was missing. I know I didn't take it out. I've replaced my locks since then. I still go out on shoots, but never alone and never near that cornfield. It was late November, already dark before dinner, and a cold drizzle had been coming down all afternoon. My place is a small one-story house on the edge of a farming town in upstate New York, the kind of place where everybody knows everybody. I work at the feed store, nothing exciting. 2 nights earlier, I'd been out behind the house stacking wood when I saw something strange in the sky. It was a set of 3 dull orange lights moving in a slow triangle, completely silent. They passed overhead, stopped for a few seconds, then shot off to the east faster than anything I've ever seen. I didn't tell anyone, not my neighbors, not my coworkers. I didn't even take my phone out. That Friday night, I was watching TV with the dog at my feet when someone knocked on the front door. Not a quick rap either. 3 steady knocks. I wasn't expecting anyone, and nobody drops by out here without calling first. When I opened the door, there was a man standing on the porch. He was tall, pale, and dressed in a black suit with a black tie and white shirt. No hat. His shoes looked like polished dress shoes, way too formal for a muddy farm road. He didn't smile or introduce himself. He just said in this low, flat voice, "Good evening. May I come inside to ask a few questions?" No greeting, no name, no badge. I told him I was busy and asked what this was about. He tilted his head just slightly, almost like a bird, and said, "We're gathering information on aerial phenomena observed from this property on the evening of November 23rd at approximately 6:37 p.m. He said the time down to the minute. That stopped me cold. I hadn't told a soul about what I'd seen. I didn't even write it down anywhere. I said something like, "How do you know about that?" And he didn't answer. He just repeated, "We're gathering information." Then he pulled a small notepad out of his jacket pocket, though he didn't write anything. Up close, he looked off. His skin was almost gray, like old paper, and his lips were thin and colorless. His eyes were very dark, maybe brown, but so dark that the pupils and irises blurred together. And he didn't blink. Not once. We stood there in the drizzle with my porch light buzzing overhead, and he stared at me without blinking. I didn't want him in my house. I told him if he had questions, he could ask them right there. He started asking things in a weirdly specific way. Describe the number and arrangement of the lights you observed. Describe the direction of travel relative to true north. Describe any changes in sound level or electromagnetic interference. He said that exact phrase, electromagnetic interference, like he was reading it. I gave short answers, mostly to get him gone. I said 3 lights, moving east, silent, nothing else. When I said nothing else, he tilted his head again and stared at me for a long moment. It was the strangest stare I've ever had someone give me, completely blank, but intense, like he was waiting for me to correct myself. Finally, he asked, "Have you shared this observation with any person or agency?" I said no. He wrote nothing down, just slipped the notepad back into his jacket. Then he said, "We thank you for your cooperation." No I, no name, just we. He turned and stepped off the porch. I closed the door and leaned against it, heart pounding. The whole interaction had taken maybe 3 minutes. I went into the living room, the dog still by my chair, and tried to calm down. After a few seconds, I thought I should at least see where he was going, maybe get a license plate. I opened the door again. The porch was empty. The gravel driveway was empty. No car, no footprints in the wet dirt. The drizzle was still coming down, but there were no fresh marks where a car might have pulled in. My dog was whining softly. He almost never does that. I grabbed a flashlight and walked out to the road. It's straight for about a quarter mile in both directions, and with the drizzle and my porch light behind me, I should have been able to see a tail light, or at least a dark shape moving away. Nothing. Just the sound of rain on the leaves. I went back inside, locked the door, and sat down. My hands were shaking. An hour later, while making tea, I realized something else. When he'd been standing on the porch, I never heard the rain on his coat. It should have been dripping. Mine was soaked after a minute outside. He didn't have an umbrella, no beads of water on his shoulders. His shoes, polished leather, had been spotless. The next morning, I checked my security camera. It's an old motion-activated thing I put over the garage. It records in short clips whenever someone comes up the drive. There was nothing from that night. No car pulling in, no person walking up, no one leaving, just the normal empty driveway. I thought about telling someone, but what would I even say? That some guy in a suit knew the exact time I saw 3 lights in the sky and then disappeared into thin air? A week later, I got a letter in the mail. No return address, no postmark. Inside was a single piece of plain white paper with the words, "Thank you for your cooperation," typed in the same flat, precise way he'd spoken. I didn't keep the letter. I burned it. Since then, I haven't seen any strange lights. But at night, if a car slows down near my place, I find myself turning off the lights and waiting until it passes. I pulled over because the sky had gone weird. It was late, maybe 10:30, and the rain had backed off to a steady mist that made the road glisten. I was driving home on Route 9, the stretch that runs past Miller's farm, the one with the broken fence and that squat red barn. I'd been looking at the GPS and thinking about nothing in particular when a pale light appeared over the field to my right, just above the stalks. At first, I thought someone had left a tractor light on, but it hung there, motionless, no beam sweep, just a soft white glow like a porch lantern floating 10 or 12 feet off the ground. I did what most people do. I slowed and then stopped on the shoulder, hazard flashers blinking in the drizzle. The car went quiet except for the wipers. The light stayed where it was, steady. It didn't pulse, it didn't make a sound, and for the first minute I thought I was looking at some kind of farm equipment someone had dragged out to scare teenagers. You know, a prank. But there was no vehicle, no cab, no wires, nothing tying the glow to anything on Earth. Then, after a few seconds, it moved. Not like a plane or a helicopter. It slid sideways maybe 30 yards and stopped. Only when it moved did I notice the radio had gone to static. At first, a faint fuzz, then white noise that swallowed the local station I'd been listening to. The clock on the dash blinked 0 for a beat, then came back to the right time. I sat there and took pictures with my phone, because what else do you do? The photos were as blank as the sky, a smear where the light should have been, then nothing. The thing about phones is they never quite catch oddness cleanly. It was possibly the worst evidence I'm ever going to have. A dozen mediocre images that proved nothing to anyone but me. When the light finally winked out, just vanished, like someone had shut off a lamp, I drove on again. My hands were a little shaky. The field looked ordinary in the halo of my headlights. Anywhere else I'd have chalked it up to a tired brain and odd atmospheric reflections. Here, though, the road was empty in a way that put my skin on edge. No trucks, no other cars, no crows on the fence. The world had gone small and tight. The next morning, I found a black car parked 2 houses down from mine. It was tucked under the sycamores with tinted windows, an older model sedan, but in immaculate condition. No rust, no bumper sticker, and a license plate number that didn't ring a bell. I assumed it was a neighbor's company car, but the same car was there the following afternoon when I came out with the trash. And the next day after that, always in the same spot, always with the engine cold. Sometimes the driver's seat looked empty, sometimes there was a shadow in the passenger side. It didn't move. Around midday on the third day, I saw it pull away when I was heading for the hardware store. Not fast, like it was leaving the block, just enough to turn the corner and disappear. It looked like any black sedan until I followed it with my eyes and realized it never took a lane faster than the speed limit. It kept a steady pace a half block behind a delivery truck until the truck turned and the sedan eased off where the truck's tail had been. I shrugged it off as coincidence and went into the store. That evening, when it was raining again, I saw the car again at the end of the cul-de-sac near the diner on Pine Street. I'd been there before, the kind of diner that keeps a pot of coffee on all night and has a board that says pie fresh, even at 2 a.m. I parked, went inside for a hash brown, and when I came out, the black car was closer, idling by the pump. The driver's side tinted so dark you couldn't tell if anyone was in it. I told myself I was being paranoid. For 2 days, the car kept showing up in little observances like that. At the grocery, across from the library, parked where I knew it didn't belong in the church lot. Each time I caught sight of it, I felt that small tightness again, like the skin between my shoulder blades had been pinched and held. I told a friend at work that I thought somebody might be following me because he'd made a joke last month about hanging around the UFO guy for a laugh, and he laughed in the wrong place. The laugh that doesn't reach someone's eyes. He said to call the police if I was sure, to get a report. I didn't call the police. That Friday night, I stopped at the diner because I couldn't sit in my apartment in the dark and stare at the street any longer. It was warm inside, the fluorescent lights too bright, and an old man at the counter eating beans. The waitress, Ellie, knew me by sight, so she brought a coffee without asking. I took the booth by the window so I could watch the parking lot. The black car was there, as I had come to expect, parked far enough away that no one noticed, right at the edge of the street lamp. I didn't plan to stay long. I was halfway through my sandwich when the bell on the door chimed and 2 men walked in. They were wearing black suits. Not just dark jackets and slacks, but those old flat lapel suits that looked like they came from a tailor in another decade. Plain white shirts, dark ties, clean shoes. They moved like they had a purpose, brisk, economical steps that didn't waste motion. One had hair the color of ash, combed straight back. The other had a crease at the corner of his mouth, like he didn't mind saying uncomfortable things. Both had that sort of tidy pallor city people have after a long day inside. They came straight to my booth. "Excuse me," the taller one said, very flat. "Are you feeling well since the event?" For a minute, I thought he was joking. I said, "What event?" Like I didn't know what he meant. I'd told no one about the lights. I hadn't even told Ellie. The taller man's eyes, which were weirdly calm, didn't blink. The shorter one's eyes did, but it looked deliberate, like the blink was a practiced movement. Their faces were almost too symmetrical. They both smelled faintly of aftershave and rain, and when they stood there, the air of the diner seemed a grade colder. I laughed once because that's what people do when they don't know if they're scared. "You mean the lights over Miller's Field?" I said. I didn't explain because there was nothing to explain and because saying it out loud made it more real. "Good," the taller man said. "Continue your routine. Avoid sharing details. Keep your frequency normal. We will monitor." He said each clause as if they were bullet points on a card he had memorized. "What do you mean monitor?" I asked. My voice didn't feel like mine. Everyone in the diner had gone quiet. The old man had his fork halfway to his mouth and was frozen. Ellie was looking down at the register with a look like she'd been told to forget her order pad. The shorter one put a finger on the table like he was making a tiny mark on an invisible surface. "We are checking for adverse effects," he said. "You reported no auditory disturbances." He glanced at me, and then, with the same inexplicable synchronization, both men tilted their heads the exact same degree. The taller man's mouth made a small curve, a smile that did not touch his eyes. The shorter one's smile matched it at the same fraction of a second. I told them, "I haven't said anything." The words came out sharp. "Good," they said. The taller man added, "Keep to your schedule. Maintain social contacts. Do not conduct experiments." The meaning of that line sat heavy in the air. I could think of no experiment I'd been planning. I worked as a courier, not as someone who sets up cameras in fields. Their language was formal and clinical, the way a nurse asks a patient whether they're taking their medication. I realized they weren't from the police or some town agency. This wasn't a checkup. By then, the old man at the counter had put his fork down. A woman by the pie case had gone pale. One of the cooks, a kid with a baseball cap, slipped a pan onto the stove and concentrated on flipping eggs as if doing nothing could make the strange men vanish. The men stood there for maybe 2 minutes, then turned and walked to the door at the same slow, economical pace. They were silent. As they opened the door, I saw the black car through the rain-streaked window, its headlights off, tinted glass hiding whatever was inside. The men stepped out into the mist and were at the car in a few strides. The taller one opened the passenger door. They both slid in, and the car rolled away. It didn't accelerate. It just eased down the street, as if it had been waiting for that exact moment. Their behavior wasn't violent. It wasn't threatening in the way a man with a gun is threatening. It was procedural, like the closing of a file. The waitress came over to my table and asked if I wanted pie, voice a hair too bright. I put a 10 on the table and left without finishing my coffee. Outside, the rain had picked up. I walked home under the streetlights, thinking of how the two men had said, "we," and how none of them had introduced themselves. I replayed their words and found no new meaning, only the same clipped phrases and that odd injunction to avoid sharing details. That night, I left every light on in my apartment and stared at the door expecting a soft knock or a squeak of tires. Nothing came. The bottle of water by my bed tasted like metal. I slept in fits and started waking earlier than normal, as if I was waiting for a routine checkup I hadn't consented to. In the days that followed, the black car showed up less, but when it did, I felt it in the pit of my stomach like the end of a countdown. I saw the men once more at the gas station, through the pump glass, a reflection of black suits and pale faces moving past. They didn't approach me. They didn't need to. Their presence was a message. I haven't told the police. I told one friend, Aaron, who writes obituaries and thinks everything is humor until he's seen the joke for 3 hours. He told me to ignore it, to pretend it was a weird couple of nights. He didn't ask for details, which is why I told him more the next day. He said I should write it down in case anything else happened. So I did, longhand in a notebook that now sits on my kitchen table. The pages are crowded with times, with the way their smiles matched, with descriptions of the car and the rain and the smell of the diner's coffee. I kept driving past Miller's Field. I kept parking on the shoulder and staring at the dark, hoping to see the light again because I wanted proof and because I wanted to be able to explain this to myself in a single sensible sentence. The spot is banal in daylight, corn in neat rows, the broken fence I always meant to call the county about. The only unusual thing is that sometimes at dusk, there's a glow on the horizon, an after image of something my camera can't hold. When I lock my front door at night, I do it twice. I check the peephole. I move the curtains a hair to block my view of the street because looking for that black car has a way of making your world smaller. I go to work, I finish my deliveries, I sit in the diner sometimes and eat a late sandwich alone. Nobody asks about my health anymore. The men didn't threaten me. They didn't need to. When they asked me if I was feeling well, there was no warmth in it, no follow-up. Just a procedure to be completed and then closed, like a file in a cabinet that gets pushed shut with the exact same measured force every time. I posted the photo at midnight because I didn't know what else to do with it. I was on the harbor road, the tide low, when 3 lights hung out over the water like someone had strung little lamps above the bay. They weren't as bright as a plane, and they moved slow and deliberate, like they were pacing something below. I pulled over, climbed onto the break wall, and shot a handful of pictures with my phone. They looked cleaner on the screen than they did with my eyes. Three white dots forming a crooked triangle, sometimes wobbling, sometimes holding steady. I threw it up on the town's Facebook group with one sentence. Weird lights over the bay. Anyone else seeing this? Mostly people posted crab recipes and lost dog notices there, so I didn't expect anything. I went home and fell asleep with the window cracked open to the gulls and the distant hum of the harbor. The next morning, I went to work at the counter like any other Tuesday. I worked the early shift at a little place called Anchor and Elm. Coffee, sandwiches, a few regulars who come in before the sun. It was foggy outside, all that soft gray that makes the lamps look like moons. I clocked in, wiped the steam wand, flipped the sign. The post had 2 comments so far. One was some guy trying to sell a boat, the other just said, "Wow." Nothing urgent. Around 8 a.m., the bell over the door chimed, and a man came in and took the corner table. He was older, in a wool coat, hat low, reading the paper. 2 people came after him. Then, a little after 9, when the rush settles into a steady hum, I looked up and saw them. 2 men in black suits, the kind you see in a movie about government things. No badge, no name tag, nothing that would make them belong in a coffee shop in a fishing town. They didn't walk like tourists or townsmen. They moved with a purposeful economy, heels set, shoulders fixed. They stopped, exactly stopped, by the service counter where I was pouring someone a drip and stacking muffins. They just stood there. No order, no small talk, just 2 black silhouettes in the mist light coming through the front window. They looked ordinary at first glance. Clean suits, short hair, the taller one with a fade, the shorter one with a narrow jaw. But then I noticed something else. They stood over the counter and looked right at me and never blinked, not once. I thought at first they were just really focused on the pastry case, but the taller one's head tilted a hair, and his eyes tracked me the way an animal tracks movement. He wasn't chewing, he wasn't breathing heavy, he simply was. They stood like that for maybe 15 minutes. The place was busy enough that I should have had a dozen interactions with people, but the register line seemed quieter. People glanced and then went back to their coffees like they hadn't noticed anything unusual. I made sandwiches, took payments, and the 2 men never moved, never said a word. They were at the counter like 2 statues someone had set down. Every few minutes, one of the regulars, a guy named Pete, who always orders the sausage and egg at 9:30, would look up and smile in my direction like he saw me waving. Then he'd bend to his paper and never mention the men. A woman with a stroller sat at the table beside them and flipped through her phone at the light they made, then stood and left, earbuds in, no expression. It felt wrong and absurd, like the sensible thing would be to ask them if they wanted anything, but something held me back. I told myself it was just tiredness and a little social awkwardness. I asked a simple question at the bar, "Can I help you fellas with anything?" The shorter one turned his head just a hair, so there was no real movement of the face, and his mouth made no sound. The taller one nodded very slightly as if that answered everything. My voice sounded stupid in the empty sound that stretched between us. They had the look of men who were used to being obeyed. There's a posture that goes with that. Shoulders a little forward, chin set. I felt like I was being examined. I went back to tamping espresso, and the line of customers shuffled slowly forward. For the whole stretch, the 2 men remained a constant presence. I kept glancing at them, and each time they were in slightly different positions. The taller one with both hands lightly on the counter, the other clasping his fingers behind his back, but always in a way that suggested repetition, like actors who had rehearsed a tableau. When the rush finally thinned, and I went to wipe down the counter, they were still there. It had been 15 minutes at least. No one had come to talk to them. The paper in their hands, yes, they both held newspapers folded neat, never moved. The taller one looked at my name tag, then at me, and for the first time he spoke. "Everything all right?" he asked. His voice was flat and measured, no emphasis, the kind of voice you hear on those recorded, hoarded hold messages. It was a normal question, but because it came from someone who'd been watching me without blinking, it landed heavy. I told him yes, everything was fine, and then realized I had no idea why I was telling him anything. "Have you slept since the event?" the shorter one asked without preamble. He didn't look away. "Have you experienced headaches, ringing in the ears, disrupted appetite?" The word event made the coffee in my hand feel bright and acidic. I hadn't told anyone. Not my mother, not my boss, not the online group where I'd half joked about the lights. Only the post and that small wow response. I told them that I'd seen lights over the bay last night, that I'd taken a few pictures and posted them. It wasn't a confession, but it felt like one. They listened without expression. The taller one said, "Continue routine, avoid sharing details. If any symptoms worsen, consult your physician." He set the folded paper down on the counter between us like he was leaving a business card. It had nothing printed on it but a single small rectangle of embossed ink that looked like a barcode and no other information. At that point, the diner grew quiet in the way a room goes quiet when two people are making a speech. Someone dropped a tray in the back, and there was a small sound, then nothing. The two men straightened as if it were time to go. They turned and left the shop the same way they'd come in, without touching the door, without drawing attention. They walked through the bell and into the fog outside. And here's the part that made my stomach tighten. For the customer who'd been at the corner table the entire time, the hat-wearing man reading the paper, when I asked him later if he'd seen the two men, he blinked and said no, he hadn't. "Just you, maybe," he said, like he was half joking and half concerned at my asking. Ellie at the register had no recollection, that even though she had been on the other end of the espresso machine. "If they came in," she said, "I would have taken their orders." When I pressed, she frowned in that blank, puzzled way people give when they think someone is tired. Pete said he'd been on his phone. The woman with the stroller had no memory of standing beside us at all. It was all a small fog overlaying reality. Every camera on the wall had footage of people, a normal loop of latte art and closed mouths, but none of the place showed two men lingering by the counter. After they left, someone from the town's Facebook group, the same place I'd posted the picture, sent me a private message asking if I was okay. They'd seen my photo and called a waiver alert out. By noon, the Harbor Patrol had been looking into reports from other people about lights. I texted back that everything at the cafe was fine. For the rest of the day, I tried to focus on the sandwiches. Later, when I pulled the pictures off my phone to show my roommate, my favorite shot showed the three lights clear over the water. In the background, barely visible, there was something else. Two shapes, just beyond the shoreline, dresses of black standing straight like telephone poles. At first, I thought it was a trick of light. When I zoomed in, there they were, faint and indistinct. The taller one with his hands in front of him, the shorter with his head cocked. They were in the frame precisely where the men had stood that morning. I didn't post that photo. I didn't mention the card on the counter. Ellie, who'd worked mornings for 6 years, suggested maybe I'd been more tired than I thought. "You got a lot going on," she said, kind and small. "Maybe you're just jumpy." I wanted to argue, but what would that prove? I told her I was fine and stacked muffin cases until my arms ached. That night, I rode the late bus home under a low sky. The fog had lifted, and the lights over the bay were gone. My roommate had friends over. They were loud and cheerful, but I couldn't settle. At 2 in the morning, I got up to pee, and the kitchen was dark and still, except for my phone lighting up with one new notification, a direct message from a user I didn't recognize. The message contained nothing but a single image, the same photo I'd taken of the three lights. The timestamp was earlier than my post had been. No username, no caption. I looked again at the little card they'd left. There was a dull rectangle where the ink had been pressed into the paper. It looked like nothing and like everything at the same time. In the following days, I kept expecting something to happen. I kept waiting to be called in, to be asked questions, to be told to stop posting, to be given a list of instructions. I drove past the harbor and watched the water and the sky for anything out of place. Sometimes a black car would be parked down by the marina, and when I looked twice, it was gone. Sometimes my phone would glitch. The camera app would freeze and then show a still from earlier, like it was stuck on yesterday. Once the cafe's security footage had a 10-second stretch at 9:15 where the video feed pixelated and came back with no audio, the system logged it as a temporary fault. We replaced the cable, and nothing else happened. People at the shop changed the subject when I brought up the lights. They joked about Maya's late-night lighthouse spotting and passed me a bite of muffin. When I checked the Facebook thread later that week, the original post had been taken down. A moderator sent me a private note saying sometimes posts get flagged and removed. No one else remembered seeing the two men in the shop. The footage on the wall cameras, passable though it was, showed people moving and talking and steaming milk. The supposed tableau of two men in black didn't appear except in my photo. I went home each night and locked the door, but I slept with the light on because it felt like the reasonable thing to do. The two men didn't come back. The lights over the bay were reported here and there for a couple weeks, then nobody talked about them anymore. My photo sat in my camera roll, a small piece of evidence that looked like a trick. I stopped posting to that group. I told my roommate a toned-down version. I had a weird morning, that was all. Sometimes, washing dishes, I would find myself watching the street long after everyone else had gone to bed. Sometimes, when the fog came in off the water, I would step outside and breathe the cold damp and check how the light hit the harbor, just in case. There was nothing dramatic. No knock at my door, no late-night visit from Suits, just the regular world. My manager joked that maybe the city needed me to be their official weather reporter. I laughed. I went back to work and kept pouring coffee. In the end, nothing changed outwardly. I kept counting days and keeping my routines. Internally, it was different. I knew a shape the way you know the shape of a bruise. It wasn't obvious at first, but you can't unknow it. The two men had lingered by the counter, had asked their questions without really asking, and then left as if they had never been there at all. I kept the photo on my phone. Every so often I open it and stare at the background until the image blurs, hoping for some answer to step out of the gray. None has. The first thing I saw was the way the hens stopped. It was a hot July night, and Claire and I had the kitchen window open to catch whatever breeze would come off the drain. We live on my grandparents' place now. 3 fields, the old red barn, a sagging windbreak of cottonwoods. Nothing fancy. I was out lighting the last of the mosquito coils and watching Rex, our lab, nosing around the back porch when the henhouse went quiet. I thought something had a fox until I realized every single bird had frozen in one position, like someone had pressed pause. Then, a slow light moved over the field. It wasn't the kind of thing you see on routine nights. It wasn't a plane with strobes. There were no strobes. Instead, there was a single pale disc, low enough that if you looked at it against the cottonwoods, you could tell it was maybe the height of telephone poles. It drifted, moving without hurry from the east hedgerow toward the pond. A smooth, deliberate glide. No sound. None. The only thing that hinted at motion was the faint change in how it lit the grass. A flat, cool glow that slid past like a painter sweeping a torch. I grabbed my phone because that's what you do, and the photos were useless, washed out dots in a black field. But the sight was real. Claire came out in her slippers and looked, and then she leaned her forehead on my shoulder and said, "What the hell?" like she expected me to have an answer. Rex walked close to the fence and sat down, unusually docile, and watched it with the kind of attention dogs get when they see a kite. We watched until it eased past the pond and over the woodlot, and then vanished into the dark, like someone had taken a light out of the sky and set it in a pocket. We didn't call anyone. We told ourselves we'd be ridiculous if we did, and besides, we didn't know what to say. The county sheriff's office would probably chuckle us into filing a report for lost property or something. So we cleaned up, shut the windows, and tried to sleep. It was the little things that made the weirdness keep coming. The next morning, the battery on my pickup was dead, though I'd left the lights off. My radio had a split second of static at noon, even though reception there is usually fine. Claire's watch lost 5 minutes over the course of an afternoon, then found them again an hour later. The hens wouldn't go back near the east hedge. They pecked a tighter line along the coop. Grandma Ellen, who's lived on this place for 50 years, told me she dreamed of standing in a field and hearing voices in the grass. She laughed it off over coffee, but she kept her purse at the table where she could see it. I figured it was a string of odd coincidences. The weather had been strange, still and humid, and odd things happen on farms. You get a leak here, a stalled engine there. Still, when I checked the old game camera on the corner post by the pond, there was a clip that made my stomach slide. The file was 6 seconds of black, then static, then 6 more seconds of black. No image at all. The timestamp read 2 a.m. The hens had gone quiet at about 11 p.m. The light had gone over at maybe 11:13. Those times weren't the same, but they were close enough to make patterns in my head. We talked about the light minimally. Claire put the dishes away, like she always did, but halfway through she paused and rubbed her palms together, the way she does when she's trying to stop thinking about something. "Maybe we should call somebody," she said once, just to put it on record. I said we would the next day because that felt safer than doing anything right away. He came the next evening. It was still light when the knock came, the soft, polite knock you expect from a neighbor returning a cup of sugar. I wasn't expecting anyone. I wiped my hands on a towel and opened the door. The man on the porch was in a dark suit that looked too new for the gravel drive. His shoes were clean, his coat hung neat. He had no hat. His hair was close cropped and the color of river rock. He looked like someone who had stepped out of a downtown office and found himself on a farm by mistake. "Evening," he said. He spoke without the usual town small talk. "I apologize for the intrusion. May I have a glass of water before we discuss last night?" It came out soft and flat, like someone reading a phrase off a card. He did not wait for me to offer. He only had to say the words, and the rest followed. There was something peculiar about the phrase, "before we discuss last night." He said it as if he and I were expected to have things to discuss, as if the visit weren't a surprise. I glanced over my shoulder. Claire was at the kitchen island, watching from the other side of the doorway. Grandma Ellen was in the rocker by the stove, knitting needles ticking. The dog patted his feet on the floor and gave a single, short bark. "I don't know," I started. "Who are you?" "We are conducting routine inquiries regarding observed aerial phenomena," he said. "A glass of water would be appreciated." He had the kind of face that doesn't show much expression. His eyes were a color I couldn't place for a second. Not quite brown, not quite gray, and he did not blink while he spoke. It was the most ordinary refusal to be ordinary. I told myself he was probably with the county somewhere. People in suits do stop on farms sometimes for business, insurance, zoning, all that. There was a county fair in town. Maybe he'd been on his way. I filled a simple glass from the tap and handed it to him on the porch step. He took it politely, fingers wrapped around the glass in a way that made me think he'd taken tea before in 1,000 houses. He drank nothing. When I realized he hadn't lifted the glass to his lips, I felt stupid for handing it over. "You okay?" I asked. He set the glass on the porch rail and said, "Thank you. Now, would you describe what you observed?" His voice had an economy to it. Each sentence was a neat package. He didn't write anything down. He didn't take my phone, didn't ask for footage, didn't take the glass. He only asked and waited. So I told him. I described the pale disc, the way it hung over the pond, how it slid into the trees and went out. I told him the hens froze, that Rex sat and watched, that the camera by the post had nothing but a blank clip at 02:12 a.m. Claire added that her watch lost time. Grandma Ellen mentioned her dream. He nodded after each piece of description like notes were being taken inside someone else's head. Once he leaned slightly and said, "Any auditory phenomena? Headaches? Ringing?" I thought of Brent at the feed store talking about tinnitus from loud tractors and told him no ears ringing, nothing that would prompt a doctor. He listened with those small, still eyes, and when I finished he said, "We thank you for your cooperation." He did not take the glass. He did not put it in his coat pocket. He stood up, placed 2 small fingers on the rim as if to secure it, and without moving the glass an inch, walked back off the porch and down the drive. He passed through the next gate, and then he turned toward the pond. I watched him walk between the trees like a person finding a familiar corridor. Within 30 yards, the light through the leaves swallowed him, and he was gone. We stood there for a long time. Claire had dropped the dish towel. Grandma Ellen's knitting slid out of her hands. Rex flattened his ears and gave a low whine. The glass sat untouched on the porch rail where he'd left it. Hours went by. The sun dipped. The corn shimmered. The crickets woke. Finally, with the sky dark and the porch light on, Claire went out to get the glass and pour it down the sink. The glass was empty, not spilled, not evaporated in the way an open container might thin in a summer breeze. It was as if the water had never been there at all. The rim was dry, the glass cool. I put my fingers inside it and there was no trace of waterline, no scent of mineral tang on the edges. I walked the path he'd taken to the gate and the grass was untouched, no footprints, nothing that suggested the man had bent over to take a drink and then walked away. That night we sat with the windows closed and the porch light on, and no one slept well. We'd lived long enough on a farm to know coyotes, to know storms, to know the dozens of small dangers that walk the fields. This was none of those things. In the mornings after that, there were more small oddities. The coop door would be shut, though I'd left it open. My pickup's tailgate would be locked, though I'd left it down. The radio in the shop cut to 2 seconds of static at noon, even when I tuned it to different stations. Grandma Ellen started leaving her porch light on until I asked her not to, because it kept the hens closer to the yard and let Rex sleep better. The man in the suit never came back. We never saw a car parked on the road that might match the suit or his gait. The glass on the rail stayed an object of suspicion until I finally put it in the cupboard with the other dishes and tried to treat it like a normal glass. Sometimes I look at that cupboard and think of the hens frozen like statues, of the quiet field where a single light moved like someone sweeping a hand across velvet, of the way the man's tongue didn't move when he spoke, and the way he left a glass full of water and never took a sip. I don't call it an event or a visitation. I don't make up stories about UFOs or secrets. I tell it to friends like this because people tell stories when the world hands them small, bright mysteries and asks them to hold them for a while. The man asked for water and left it on the porch. The water was gone by morning. We went about our chores. The seasons moved like they always do. The hens have gone back to pecking near the east hedge. Sometimes at night, I still glance at the pond. I was on the shoulder, engine idling, when the first car passed me like it didn't see anything at all. It was almost midnight and the rain had gone soft, not hard enough to sheet the pavement, just enough to slick it and make the highway lights smear. I'd been headed back from a job in the next county, the kind of long single-lane stretch where your only company is the white line and the occasional sign for a diner you never stop at. I slowed because something was wrong with my headlights. 1 minute they were the normal dim yellow, then they blinked twice and went bright blue for a second like someone had turned a knob. The other drivers didn't slow. They cut past me and took the lane like they hadn't seen me even touching the brakes. Then, over the tree line to the east, a light hovered. At first, it looked like one of those construction signs, the ones that hang over the road and glow, but it was high and stationary and it wasn't fixed to anything. It was a round, soft kind of light hanging maybe 100 feet above the guardrail, motionless like someone had set a lamp on a pole and walked away. I pulled off the shoulder and killed the engine because my hands were shaking and I needed to be still. The rain made a soft hiss on the hood. My phone didn't get any signal, but I didn't try to film. That always feels like an admission of fear. I just watched. It stayed there for maybe 5 minutes, shrinking the distance with my field of vision as cars went by under it. People were driving past close enough that I could have flagged one down, but no one did. If anything, I got the sense that the cars were moving around something without noticing it. Okay? The light didn't have a beam, no strobe, nothing like a plane. It was a clean disc, a pale washed color that I couldn't at first categorize. When I finally decided to write it down on the Notes app later, the closest I could get was soft white with a blue wash, and that felt clumsy and inadequate even in memory. As I watched, the radio cut to static. Not the usual fading in and out, but a sudden choke and a white roar, like the speaker had been disconnected from anything that could make sense. My dashboard clock blinked 0 for a second and then corrected itself. The little digital thermometer that sits on the dash flickered 2 degrees down, then back up. Small things you don't notice until you notice them. A truck passed by 2 lanes over and I saw the driver's face. He was staring at the windshield, not at the sky. His mouth moved, maybe calling out to a passenger, maybe not. He didn't slow down. The light slid sideways then, not sharply, but like a thing being nudged on a tabletop. It moved over the median and stopped. The air felt thicker around me, not like wind or pressure, but like someone had drawn a curtain. I remember thinking weirdly about a pot of coffee left on a burner, the way the aroma hangs in a kitchen. And then that feeling of domestic normality got pushed out by unease. When the light winked out, it did so without fading. One frame it was there, like a photograph taped to the sky. The next frame it was gone. No engine noise followed it, no echo, nothing. I sat a long time in the dark car and let the taillights of distant trucks ghost across the dash. I drove home cautious, my speed not much over the limit, because wanting to be back in my own bed after something odd is a simple, honest thing. My neighborhood was quiet when I finally turned off the main road into the older strip where the gas station and the 24-hour market sat. I pulled up to the pump because I needed gas and coffee, and because, stupidly, sitting in a fluorescent-lit shop felt like a reasonable antidote to the highway stillness. The station was empty except for the gas attendant, a kid named Marco who recognized me from a job last month. He waved me toward pump 3. I filled the tank and walked into the convenience store to grab a coffee. The place smelled like diesel and peppermint gum, fluorescent light baking the aisles. 2 men were at the counter when I walked in. They weren't dressed the way anyone around here dresses. Both wore dark suits, black shoes, polished like they'd come from a shop downtown, not from some road trip. Their hair was short, neat. One was taller by a head, with a square jaw and a face like carved stone. The other was slighter, with a thin nose and a close-shaved beard. They stood side by side a few feet away from the cooler, not buying anything, just standing like petrified figures. When I pushed open the door, the bell clanged and they both turned their heads in that same small motion. You noticed details in these moments. The taller man's tie was slightly misaligned, not crooked in a sloppy way, but just off a hair. The shorter man had a tiny scuff on the right shoe. Neither of them looked at the cashier or at Marco. They looked at me, and after my odd night, I felt like a deer whose eyes have caught the hunters. I blurted a hello. They didn't speak for a beat. "Sir?" The taller one said then, and his voice was neutral. "You were on Route 47 earlier this evening, were you not?" It was more a statement than a question, and the fact he knew the route bothered me because I hadn't told anyone. I nodded. "Yeah." "Headed back from the mill?" he asked. "Did you observe any aerial lights approximately 8 miles east of the bridge?" The pocket of air around my throat tightened. "Yes," I said. "I did." They listened without taking a breath. The shorter one glanced down at his hands and then looked up with an expression that made me read his face twice. Not angry, not friendly, just puzzled. "Describe the exact color of the lights," he said. "Not white or blue. The color you remember, precisely." It was a weirdly specific question. I thought for a second about how colors can be hard to pin down, especially something that happens at night. I remembered the light was pale, like the inside of an overcast day, but with a temperature cool enough that the edges shifted toward blue when I blinked. I told them exactly what I remembered. It was like a soft white with a blue wash, more blue than a halogen, but softer than a neon. Imagine the kind of blue you see in a pale winter window, not electric, but clean. They both exchanged a look at that. A quick movement, a tightening at the corner of the taller man's mouth, the shorter man tilting his head as if he'd misheard something. It lasted less than a second, but the timing felt like the point of the whole visit. The taller man's face went blank, and for the first time he let his eyes meet mine properly, and I saw something like confusion slide through him. "Excuse us," the taller man said, with an abruptness that made Marco, who was bagging chips at the register, glance up. "We appreciate your time." He stepped back as if the conversation were now over. They left exactly the same way they came in. Straight out the glass door, not buying anything, not touching the pumps. They walked out into the rain like men who had somewhere precise to be. I watched them go, expecting them to get into a car, but there was no car parked in front of the station when they crossed the lot. For a ridiculous moment, I thought they'd ducked behind a truck, but there was no vehicle big enough to hide 2 grown men without making a sound. I paid for my coffee with paper money because my card felt too slow to use and Marco didn't ask for the receipt. Outside, the rain had started to pick up again, the streetlights blooming into halos. I walked to my car and fumbled the keys, feeling like I'd been pulled out of a daydream under an old billboard. I started the engine and sat with the heater on, the smell of coffee hanging in the car, watching the edge of the station. 10 minutes later, a black sedan rolled slowly past the pump islands, 2 blocks over, and then eased down the side street. I watched it, half hoping it would park and the 2 men would step out, but the car didn't stop. It moved with a patient, measured pace and then turned onto the main road, swallowed by the rain and the neon blur. I drove home with the headlights low and the radio on at a polite volume, not wanting the static to return. For 3 mornings after that, I kept replaying the color question in my head. It was, logically, an odd thing to ask. People who study lights might want EXIF data or wavelengths. Citizens asking what shade of blue you saw is the sort of thing a journalist would bring up, not anonymous men in suits at a gas station. The rest of that week went back to normal in the outward sense. I worked, drove the county roads, mowed the yard. Inside, though, things were quieter. I noticed the small glitches more readily, the clock on the oven blinking once at 2:12 a.m., then correcting itself. My phone flashing a temporary loss of carrier while I was on hold. The electrical hum in the house taking a soft skip. Once, while making dinner, I realized I'd been standing in the kitchen for 6 minutes staring at the window, and I had no idea what had occupied my brain during that time. Little skips like that made me watch the edge of my life. I told Marco the story the next time I went in for gas, partly to hear it out loud and check my own memory against his face. He shrugged like the sensible city kid he was and said he'd seen a car pull through the lot that night. Black, clean, but he hadn't thought to pay much attention beyond that. He didn't remember 2 men at the counter. Might have been those weirdos with the suits getting coffee, he said, and it sounded like he was guessing more than remembering. A week later, I was walking to the car when I noticed a small, folded scrap of paper on the bumper of a pickup across the lot. I picked it up. It was a receipt from the gas station that had been printed at 11:43 p.m. The timestamp matched the hour of the lights. On the back of the receipt, someone had scrawled in neat block letters, "Color," and beneath it a single letter, "B." I folded the paper into my pocket and drove home. I thought about calling someone to say what I'd seen, the county office, the local paper, a blog, but every time I tried to form the call in my mouth, it sounded like a small private thing, like gossip you tell over the fence. When I did tell one friend, Kasia, she listened and said, "You were precise. Good. Keep it that way." She's a nurse, and she still sounded like she wanted to advise. That was all. I suppose what lingered afterward wasn't the men's question or the look they exchanged. It was the sense that they were surprised in a way that had nothing to do with me being honest. They expected something else when I said the blue was a pale, clean winter blue. That brief confusion on their faces felt like a keyed mismatch. Not threat, not alarm, but the same expression you get when a script you've recited 100 times breaks on the wrong page. They never came back. The station stayed open. Marco kept the coffee warm. The highway went on, carrying its careless traffic. I can't say the world rearranged itself around my answer. The next time I drove past the tree line, there was no light, nothing but the constant white glare of the rain-slicked road. I kept the receipt folded in my glove compartment for a long time, then put it in the trash when I moved a box of maps, and it fell out. The memory of that night hangs there differently than other odd things, less like a movie and more like a small missing tile in the floor you notice when you walk into the room. We were on the 3rd night of a long weekend trip when the lights showed up over the lake. We usually went out to Clear Pond to get away from town. No cell service, one rickety boat launch, a vault toilet that smelled like wet pine. The 5 of us, me, Alex, Maya, Brent, Lena, and Omar, had a couple of tents set up on the ridge above the water and a fire pit down by the shore. It had rained in the afternoon, and then the clouds thinned enough to leave that bright, hard summer sky you get when the humidity hangs low, but the air is clearing. We'd eaten hot dogs, thrown a frisbee that kept getting blown off course, and then sat in a ring around the fire with our head lamp beams off, just listening. Around 11, when the bugs had gone quiet and Brent was telling a story about a raccoon in his neighbor's trash, things felt, I don't know, a little smaller and slower than usual. You notice the cadence of the night when you're not in a city. The frogs across the water had their own rhythm. The fire crackled. Then Maya, who was leaning back on her elbows with her face turned toward the lake, said, "Hey, do you see that?" At first I thought she meant the moon, but the moon was where it always was. About 100 yards out over the pond there were 3 pale lights, not very bright, hanging maybe 20 feet above the surface. They moved together slowly, like someone had 3 lanterns on cables and was walking them across the water, except there was no boat, no rope, no sound. They drifted a little, paused, then slid sideways in perfect unison. For a while, we just watched, the 5 of us silent, our marshmallows forgotten on sticks. I grabbed my phone and took a few pictures. The camera didn't do it justice, just smeared white dots, but the display showed something, and somehow seeing it there on the screen made it feel more real. Brent swore it was some fishing lights from the far shore. Lena said it was drone hobbyists from the weekend campers that had set up near the inlet. None of those explanations quite fit. The lights didn't have the flicker of LEDs, they didn't change color, and they never blinked like navigation lights do. More than that, the nature sounds around us didn't react. The frogs kept on, the ducks didn't fly, no waves kicked up. After 20 minutes, they faded, like someone turned a dimmer. We sat there longer, half expecting them to come back. The conversation lessened into little, hesitant sentences. We were tired, so we went to our tents and played out the normal ritual. Brushed teeth, set alarm for the boat launch, checked the cooler. But none of us slept well that night. Lena woke once and said she felt like someone was walking around the edge of the trees, though when she shone her headlamp outside, there was nothing. In the morning, we joked about calling the local paper and running a mystery lights over Clear Pond column. More realistically, we wanted breakfast and coffee. We were packing when we saw the car pull up at the entrance to the drive, an unmarked dark sedan not more than 5 minutes past sunrise. That struck me as odd. People don't usually come by at 8 to stare at campers. 2 men in suits got out. They were in black, not the cheap suits of city kids, but more formal, heavy-looking, ties neat, shoes clean. They didn't hurry. They walked up the path and stopped maybe 20 feet away from our tarped cooler, where the dew was still clinging to the grass. "Morning," the taller one said. His voice wasn't loud. It was flat, the kind of neutral voice people use when they read from a prompt. He did not say his name. He did not ask his business card for a business. He just asked, "We were told you observed aerial lights over Clear Pond last night. Would you describe what you saw?" There was a small, quiet beat where each of us looked at the others as if one of us would have already told the story. I said, "Yeah, there were 3 lights, low over the water. They moved together, no sound." Omar added that they had hung about 20 feet up and then faded. Brent said they didn't look like flares. Maya trailed off because she couldn't quite figure how to describe the way they seemed to slide without disturbing anything. The shorter man, he kept his hands behind his back, listened with a stillness that felt odd. He didn't take notes. He didn't hold a phone up. Nothing. He just stood and watched our faces as we talked. When one of us would get to the point where we tried to give an explanation like, maybe drones, both men would interject in the same quiet voice, "Please describe only what you observed, not explanation." That was fine for a while. It made the story painfully exact. We described the spacing, the way the reflections on the water behaved, the color temperature of the glow. The taller man asked, without blinking it seemed, "Did any electronics in the camp experience interference? Radios, phones, GPS devices, any tinnitus or headaches?" It felt like an odd list of questions, but Brent said his head had rung when the lights were at their brightest, a sort of high-pitched whine, and Lena said her phone had snapped off and back on again twice while she was trying to get a photo. Maya said her pocket compass had spun for a minute and then settled. I told them about the camera photos being useless, just smudged dots, and how the video files looked like they'd stuttered. The men nodded at each of these little details. They never wrote anything down. Not once. There was no pen of any kind. When we asked them who they were, they smiled the same tiny fraction and said, "We're conducting routine follow-up in the area." That answer felt specific in its vagueness. We asked again if they were with the sheriff or with some agency. They repeated, "We're conducting follow-up." It was like answering, "What day is it?" with "It's a day." I noticed things about them that made your attention drag, the sort of details you don't say out loud. Their skin looked like it had never seen wind. Their eyes were the color of dark coffee grounds, and neither of them seemed to blink properly. Maya mentioned that quietly to Omar, and he shrugged like he'd noticed too, but didn't want to be the one to say it. People would have expected an interrogation or an attempt to collect the phone files or something to that effect. Instead, they stood there, listening, and then asked us politely, "Has anyone else been informed of the observation? Any social media posts, calls, or visitors?" I said I'd put a single photo on a local community page the night before. Nothing more. Lena said she'd mentioned it to her sister over text. Brent swore he hadn't told anyone. The shorter man's jaw tightened a fraction. The taller said, "We appreciate your candor. Continue routine. Avoid sharing details beyond necessary contacts." He said those words in such a matter-of-fact way that you could have slid them into a work policy and they would have looked normal. After about 15 minutes, maybe less, maybe more, the coffee pot in the ranger station hissed the way it sings when someone's making a full pot. The shorter man asked very plainly, "May we ask the names of everyone at this gathering?" He said it like a roll call. He didn't reach for a notebook. He didn't open a phone. He merely waited. I gave my name. Maya gave hers. Brent and Lena and Omar gave theirs. I remember thinking I should ask for a card or at least a badge, because standing there on gravel with two strangers in black suits, asking your name feels exactly like the opening scene to any number of things you don't want. When one of us actually asked, the taller man's mouth made a tiny smile, and he said, "We have the necessary identifiers." That was the same tone he'd used before. Courteous. Final. Then someone, probably Brent, because he gets like this when he's nervous, asked them if they had any names. The shorter man didn't look surprised. He tilted his head and said, "Names are not necessary here." He didn't climb any higher in explanation. He didn't hand us some official card. He turned and walked toward the tree line at the edge of our sight. It was a normal enough motion at first. Two men walking back into the woods, but they didn't follow the little footpath we all used. They just stepped off the grass and into the trees, and the brush swallowed the sound of their shoes. We watched them until the morning light swallowed the shape of them. They kept walking straight among the trunks like they were going down a hallway. After a moment, Lena said, "Where'd they go?" And we all realized they'd stopped being visible. There was no rustle or crumple of dead leaves where they'd gone. The light through the pines where they disappeared looked the same as it had 5 seconds before. We called the ranger on a cordless. The county had chained to the pole, but the ranger was out checking a damaged sign and didn't get there for 40 minutes. When he finally came and we told him about the men, he nodded slowly and asked for a description. He took our names and made a note in his little book, but when he drove off to check the trail cams, there was nothing on the cameras. Just the empty grassy path and a stretch of trees. No car on the road at the camp entrance except our own. No footprints in the soft ground where the men had walked. The mud near the boat launch had no marks beyond ours. We packed up faster than we'd planned. Nobody wanted to fish or swim after that. Brent said he felt like the air was too thin, like you notice your own breath too loudly. Maya was pale and quick to laugh at small jokes that weren't funny. Lena kept rubbing her eyes and said the thing about the man's coffee-colored eyes made her skin prickle. Omar drove, quiet, hands white on the steering wheel. We didn't stop until we passed the town signs, and the highway swallowed the sound of the tires. Back home, I checked the photos again. One of my pictures, the one I thought had captured the lights best, had a thin gray line near the tree line where, for a sliver of a second, the taller man's shoulder had been visible. When I blew it up, it was grain and shadow, and really nothing you could make out with any confidence. Maya's phone showed a similar smudge. Brent said his camera had corrupted the last two files. Lena swore her compass had kept its own small spin for 15 minutes after we left the site. I don't know what any of that means. I wrote it up in the local group thread because I didn't know who else to tell. I used our real names because I wanted a public record, not to start gossip. A couple of people said they'd seen lights up the road days before. Others said it had to be people with LED kites. A guy wrote that people like us should stop camping alone. The next day, a woman who runs a bird watching column asked if she could come by and ask some questions, and then never called again. The ranger stopped by with a business card that said Division of Natural Lands, and then left it on the porch and said he'd check with county dispatch and see if anyone had logged a missing person. None of us got a phone call from an agency. None of the local police wrote us back. The two men had asked polite, specific questions and then walked into the trees and weren't there in a place where, if you walked into the brush, you'd have left a half dozen signs. We went back to work. We went to our apartments and our jobs and the grocery stores and the bus stops. We kept the photos, half hopeful and half annoyed that they said so little. Brent mentioned the incident twice at work in the back room, and the guys at the shop shrugged and said some guy must have been conducting tests. Every so often, I open the folder with the photos. I zoom in on the smear in the tree line and try to steady it into a face. I tell myself not to make more of the day than there is. The men in suits were polite. They asked us to recount what we observed without writing it down. They said names weren't necessary. They walked into the woods and stopped being visible. That's what happened. I drove home. I called the number on the ranger's card once to ask if anything had turned up and left a message that they didn't return. Life started the small, tolerable sequence of routine again. Coffee in the same mug, work shifts, the same guy at the bus stop who reads a paper without looking up. But every time I think of the way those two men turned toward the pines and vanished, I find myself checking the closet door twice before I go to bed. I filmed it because I couldn't not. I'd been hiking the Ridgeway Trail since I was a kid, and I know when to put the phone away and when to take it out. This was the kind of sighting that felt small and sensible in the moment, but too good to lose. It was August, the kind of hot dusk where the air hangs like a blanket, and the bugs make a steady shush in the leaves. I had started late because work had run over, and I was above the third switchback when the thing showed up. At first, I thought it was a reflection, sun dragging off the surface of the stream below, or maybe some guy with a flashlight and bad timing. But it was higher than the tree line, not a reflection at all. It was silver, maybe 20 to 30 feet across, flattened on the bottom so it looked like a coin suspended on edge. It moved slow and deliberate, no jerks, no wings, and there was no sound. Birds kept flying past it and didn't spook. The air did not change. I switched on my camera and shot a short clip, my hand a little shaky because you realize you're doing something you might later have to defend as not being a hallucination. The clip didn't capture a lot. My phone showed the usual downgrading, grain in the dark, the silver a smear, but when I replayed it right there, the motion looked wrong in the best way. The object slid left, paused, and then drifted off behind the ridgeline. I stayed put for a long time after, sweating and thinking. I didn't post the clip anywhere that night. I told myself I'd sleep on it. I didn't sleep. The next day, I put the clip on my laptop and watched it again. If you're used to digital things, you learn to mistrust them. Cameras crop and compress, and phone cameras are worse in low light. The file was noisy, but you could see the shape, and you could see how the leaves in the foreground didn't rustle when it passed. I sent it to Ben, who runs the outdoor blog I write for, and he replied in 5 minutes with the kind of joke only people who know each other well make. Either you found a mirror factory in the sky, or you've had one too many trail beers. He asked where I'd been, and I told him, and he said he'd come up next weekend with a pair of binoculars. That evening, sitting at the kitchen table with the clip on loop, I noticed my wall clock slip a minute forward. I shrugged it off as the cheap clock it was, but then my bedside alarm phone blinked 2:13 a.m., even though I'd turned the alarm off. I nudged it and the display corrected itself. Tiny, nothing things. Mostly, they made me notice the rest of my day in a way I hadn't before. How I walked where the light hit the windows, like looking for seams. 2 nights after the hike, the first one pulled up outside my house. It was a black sedan, older model but in near new condition, sitting under the street lamp on the curb across from my place. I live on a narrow lane where cars don't park overnight unless someone's visiting. It was exactly 2:13 a.m. according to my phone's little corner clock because I checked it when I turned, half awake from a nap. The driver's area was dark, the windows heavily tinted. The headlights were off. There was no engine noise. The lane smelled like cut grass and warm asphalt. I stood by the curtain and watched. The car idled there for 18 minutes, and every minute ate something from the house on the inside. My dog, Gus, who is normally sound asleep on the rug, got up and padded to the door and sat, not barking, but staring. He's a good dog, not skittish, and the way he looked at the window felt like a warning. When the car finally left, it did so slow and quiet. It rolled away and disappeared at the first intersection, like it had started the engine only when it wanted to be seen leaving. The next night, same time, 2:13 a.m., same place. The night after that, same again. For a week, the sedan appeared under the street lamp like clockwork. I tried to catch someone getting out. I stepped into the backyard in my shorts and flip-flops and called out toward the lane. My voice sounded silly against the quiet. The car didn't move. Once I thought I saw a silhouette in the passenger side, like someone leaning forward, but when I blinked, it was gone. A neighbor who walks his dog early in the morning told me he thought I was tired when I asked him if he'd seen the car. He said he'd glanced and it looked empty. I started logging it. 2:13 a.m., 2:13 a.m., 2:13 a.m. I even set my old analog watch by the wall clock because obsession makes you want more measurements. I tried different tricks. I put my motion camera on the porch aimed at the street, cheap but serviceable. I left the hallway light on with the blinds up. I sat in my car with the engine running in the driveway, waiting with the radio low. Each night, the sedan was there at 2:13, and each night I came up with a new reason to doubt what I was seeing. Maybe it was a coworker's friend. Maybe it was someone watching for car thieves. Maybe I'd been keyed into a coincidence and the human brain loves patterns. Ben kept asking for the clip. He thought he could run it through some filters and make a better image. I was reluctant to hand it over because it felt like private proof, the sort of thing you keep in case you need to show someone and have the world tilt toward believing you for a moment. I made copies and put one on an SD card and slid it into the top drawer. That night, the car was there at 2:13. I slept with the lights on. On the 8th night, the car stayed until 3:01 a.m. I noted the change with a small kick of adrenaline, and then at 3:02, the car turned and came down the block and eased to a stop opposite my house. That's when I couldn't stand it anymore. I grabbed my keys, my flashlight, and went out. The porch boards creaked under my feet. Gus followed me, but stopped at the threshold. He is not a confrontational dog. The car's windows were black. The license plate looked ordinary, but when I trained my flashlight at it, the plate reflected like any plate would, and then the digits looked wrong. Not missing, but blurred by a soft bloom that reduced numbers to shapes. I felt foolish and small and terribly exposed. I called out, "Hey!" in what I hoped was an assertive tone. Nothing. Then the sedan's passenger window rolled down a finger's width with a quiet, precise motion, and a hand reached out and tapped the glass of the driver's side first. Not in hail your attention way, but almost perfunctorily, like a metronome. The touch made no sound on the glass. No one opened a door. No one stepped out. The car idled with radioactive patience. I stood there a long minute, waiting for a human reaction, for the shuffling of feet or the buzz of a phone. The car's interior remained a dark cave. Finally, I felt my face burn hot with foolishness and walked back inside. For the next 2 days, the car was there. Gus would sit by the window and watch and never bark. Ben showed up the following weekend with those big binoculars and his skeptical face, and he spent an afternoon on my roof with his tripod and told me to slow down on the paranoia. If someone is following you, he said, get plates. Call the cops. The first part I tried to do later that night when I saw the sedan again. I dialed 911, and the PCP said if there was no threat, there wasn't a lot they could do, and could I call in the morning with a description. I felt ridiculous and safe enough to be ignored. Then the other little things started. My phone, which usually charged on the nightstand fine, failed to charge one night and displayed only a black screen. My cheap porch camera recorded an empty street with one anomalous blank in the footage, an odd black rectangle about a meter across right where the car had been. If you watched the video frame by frame, there was nothing. One instant the street, the next instant a column of nothing, and then empty street again. The camera logged the clip with a timestamp of 2:13:07. The DVR in the garage, same story, a brief patch where the feed went gray and then returned. I tried to play the missing fragment back on the laptop, and the media player simply stalled. A week in, I saw the car from the intersection at the end of the lane and drove up behind it. Maybe, I thought, if I followed at a reasonable distance, the driver would turn and I'd get a plate. I kept 50 yards behind, and the car never seemed to speed up or slow down to distance me. It simply maintained that perfect gap, like a shadow. We passed one stoplight and then another, and at the second light, the car in front of us eased forward, and then, with no blink or pause, it wasn't there. The road ahead was empty, and the GPS showed a solid line of road. I checked the mirror for brake lights. Nothing. I sat on the horn like an idiot for a second, and then the car reappeared at the next bend, idling at the curb like it had been waiting for me to notice something in particular. I was near the edge of being honest with myself. Whatever was happening, it wasn't random. It wasn't a person playing a prank, unless the prankster had money and the patience of a saint. Then they came to the door. It was a Tuesday. Rain like someone was rinsing the world. Gus thumped his tail but didn't bark when the knock came. It was 2:13 a.m., which I only noticed because the digital clock on my microwave flickered awake the moment the knock started. There were 3 of them, measured and clear on the front step. I opened the door and 2 men were standing in the dark, black umbrellas folded like swords at their sides, long black coats over suits. They were not at all what you expect in a late-night doorstep glare. Their suits were matte and well-tailored, their shoes clean. They had simple faces, neither particularly young nor old, and both wore neutral expressions that made their eyes look a little too intent. "Good evening," the taller one said. He sounded like a radio announcer without the smile. "We are here to speak about your footage." My heart lurched because I hadn't told anyone I'd filmed the object. I felt sick with that private proof in the top drawer. "Who are you?" I asked, keeping my voice lower than I felt. The shorter man's mouth moved slowly. "We're with the office," he said. "We need to review the original file. Please." "How did you?" I began, and stopped because it sounded alarmist, and I wanted to be calm and reasonable on some human level. "You can hand it to us, or we can wait." The tall one spread his hands a hair, palms up, an oddly conciliatory gesture. "We're not here to make trouble." I could feel the ridiculousness of bargaining with 2 strangers on my porch at 2:13 a.m., but I also felt that old, stubborn part of me that hates being bullied. The SD card was in my drawer. I could hand it over and be done, and maybe the car would stop appearing and my sleep unstick. Or I could hold on to it and keep measuring. "I don't want anyone riffling through my stuff," I said. "If you're law enforcement, show a badge." They exchanged a look, the kind people exchange when they know something private. The taller man's face didn't change. "We are not law enforcement in the familiar sense." He said it as if he'd offered a weather report. The shorter man added, "You reported no auditory disturbances?" "No," I said, slow. My throat felt thick. They both smiled at the same instant, a tiny, synchronous lift that looked practiced. The taller man said, "Thank you for your cooperation." The shorter one nodded and tilted his head as if checking a list. Then they turned and walked away down my drive into the rain. No car waited. They simply stepped off the porch and were gone into the dark and the drizzle in the way people fall out of sight behind heavy curtains. The knock had sounded loud in the moment, and now the street was the same rain-gray stretch it had been for years. That was the last night the car pulled up. I handed the SD card to Ben a few days later and told him the whole thing, abridged and messy. He asked to keep a copy. He ran the file through filters until it looked cleaner, but it never gave more than the same silver smear to an interested eye. He told me not to post it. He said he'd been phoned by someone who identified themselves as a reporter and asked what his source on outdoor phenomena was. Ben told the man he worked with freelance folks and to go away. After the two men came and asked for the file, the nights got back to normal. Gus stopped padding to the window at 2:13. The porch camera never again showed the odd black rectangle. The car never came. The microwave clock no longer blinked at odd minutes. That doesn't mean the feeling left. I still check the trees when the wind dies down. I still wake up some nights and sit with my phone and watch the time change. I sleep, I go to work, I hike on the ridgeway when the weather is right, and once in a while I pull the clip out and look at the smear of silver and wonder what the people on my porch had seen. They said so little. We need to review the original file. We're not here to make trouble. And they left the problem where it had been, on one small shelf of my life, private and unsettled. I'm not saying I know what they were or what the car was. I don't. I know the clock on my microwave lit up at 2:13 for a while and then it didn't. I know two men in black stood on my porch and asked a polite, strange question. I know the nights rearranged themselves around that precise minute for a time. And I know Gus is a lighter sleeper now, the way someone who's been paying attention to small things is lighter. It was just after midnight when my phone buzzed on the nightstand. I'd been half asleep, drifting in that soft space between dreams and waking, and for a second I thought it was my alarm. But it was a call. My friend Eric. I hesitated before answering. He never called this late unless something was wrong. "Hey," I muttered, rubbing my eyes. "Dude," he said immediately. His voice had that nervous edge I'd only heard a few times before. "What the hell did you send me?" "I didn't send you anything," I said, sitting up. "That picture, the one you just texted." I blinked at the glow of my screen. My messages app showed nothing. "What are you talking about?" "The photo," he said again. "You sent me a picture like 5 minutes ago. It's..." He stopped, exhaling. "It's some kind of, I don't even know. A glowing thing. Over the trees. Like a craft or something. Don't tell me you didn't send it. It came from your number." "I didn't," I said flatly. There was silence for a moment. Then Eric said, "It's still on my phone. Check yours." I opened my messages. Nothing. No sent photos, no recent texts. My last message to him was 2 days ago, a meme about our fantasy league. "I'm telling you, there's nothing here." He didn't respond right away. When he spoke again, he sounded unsettled in a way that made me fully awake. "It's got your name, your number, and the picture looks like it's from your neighborhood. You've got to be messing with me." "I'm not." "Describe what you're looking at right now," he said suddenly. "My bedroom," I said. "Dark, curtains closed. Is your phone in your hand?" "Yes." "Check your gallery. Maybe it's there." I swiped to my photos. Nothing new. The last picture was from last weekend. Eric exhaled sharply. "I'll send it back to you. Hold on." A second later, my phone buzzed with an incoming photo. I opened it and felt my stomach tighten. It looked like the woods at the edge of my street. The silhouette of pines and bare oaks, the slope of the power lines crossing above, and hanging just above the trees was a pale, glowing shape. Not bright like a spotlight, but hazy and diffuse, like a jellyfish lit from within. It wasn't clear where the glow stopped, and the night began. I'd never seen anything like it. "Where did you get this?" I whispered. "From you," Eric said. "It literally says it's from you." "I didn't take this picture." Neither of us said anything for a while. I could hear him breathing. "Maybe your phone got hacked," he said finally, but without conviction. "Then why isn't it in my messages?" I slid off the bed and crossed to the window. The curtains were shut, but a thin bar of streetlight leaked in. I peeked out. The street was empty. The trees at the end of the block were dark and still. "I'm looking out my window right now," I said. "Nothing's there." Eric didn't answer. "Send me a screenshot of your messages," I said. A moment later, a screenshot came through. It was our text thread. My name at the top, his phone showing the picture I'd supposedly sent. The timestamp matched the moment he'd called. "I'm coming over," he said abruptly. "You don't have to." "I'm coming over." The line went dead. I stayed at the window watching the street. I couldn't see any cars. I kept looking at the photo he'd sent back. The angle was familiar, slightly uphill, like it was taken from the sidewalk near the park entrance at the end of the block. I opened my camera app and checked the metadata on the image. It said it was taken at 12:03 a.m., but had no other details. No GPS coordinates, no device info, just image.jp. At 12:20 a.m., Eric texted, "I'm outside." I slipped on a hoodie and went downstairs. When I opened the door, he was standing by his car with the engine running, his phone in his hand. He looked spooked. "You sure you didn't send this?" he asked again. "I'm sure." He turned his phone toward me. The photo still glowed faintly on his screen. This was taken at the park entrance. You can see the power lines. "I know where it is. Let's go look," he said. We walked down the street together. It was colder than I expected, the kind of dry cold that creeps through fabric. Our footsteps echoed louder than usual, like the air was hollow. When we reached the park entrance, everything looked normal. The wooden sign, the gravel path, the trees black against the sky. "No glow," Eric said quietly. I kept glancing at the tree line, expecting something to shift. Nothing did. "You still have the photo?" I asked. He nodded and held his phone up. "It looks like it's right there, over those trees." I looked where he was pointing. Just darkness. We stood there a long time. Eventually Eric said, "Maybe someone spoofed your number. Some kind of prank." "Then why does the picture look like it was taken here?" He didn't answer. We walked back to my house in silence. He didn't even come in, just got in his car and left. I went upstairs and sat on the edge of my bed with the lights off. My phone lay on the nightstand. I kept checking my messages every few minutes, expecting something new to appear. Nothing did. At some point, I opened my gallery again. The same old photos, no trace of that glowing shape. But when I closed my eyes, I could still see it hanging there over the trees, faint and silent, like a lantern underwater. The next morning, Eric sent me a text. "That photo's gone from my phone." I asked him what he meant. "It's just gone," he wrote. "The message is still there, but the image is blank, like it never loaded." I opened our thread. His screenshot from the night before was still there, but the image he'd sent back to me, the one he'd received from me, was gone. Just a gray box with a question mark. I scrolled through my photos again. Still nothing new. I don't know what happened that night. Neither does Eric. We don't talk about it much anymore. Sometimes, though, when I'm walking past the park entrance after dark, I stop and look up at the power lines and the trees. I half expect to see that pale, glowing shape again, waiting where only a camera can catch it. I was on my third round and thinking about tea. It was one of those fogs that come off the river and hang in the streets like someone had left curtains out overnight. Thick, low, the kind that makes the world feel smaller. My van's parcel bay was half full, the scanner still on my belt, and I'd done the usual run through the warehouses and flats down by the waterfront. Most of the city had emptied for the night. Dundee gets quiet after 11. You could hear the fog swallow sounds if you listened. The first odd thing was the radio. I always had it tuned low, a bit of speech to keep me awake. For a while it was fine. Local station, some dull late-night show. Then, just as I turned onto Lockheed Road, it went to static. Not the familiar hiss you expect when a signal fades, but a thin insect kind of static that rose and fell like someone breathing near the aerial. It flickered on for a second, and then cut to a kind of mechanical silence, like someone had pressed mute on the world. The display on the head unit blinked, but showed no station. I thumbed the dial. Nothing. Then it came back, another thin sweep of static, and then nothing again. It wasn't regular like a broken connection. It was a sort of hesitation in the air. I told myself it was the usual interference from the old buildings or the van's wiring being old. I said it out loud, because saying something out loud makes it less like your mind playing tricks. That's what I told myself for the first 5 minutes. The fog made everything anonymous. Streetlights blurred into halos that didn't reach the pavement. The terraces on Tay Street had their curtains drawn like the houses were shy. People who normally stood smoking out kebab shops were absent. The city's night workers, those who keep the buses running and the bins emptied, were mostly gone, and that meant fewer stray sounds to tell you where you were. Even dogs weren't barking much. There's a small constant hum in a city at night. That hum was thinned down to a tick. The second odd thing was the way the van behaved at idle. The engine was warm and steady, but then for a heartbeat, the dashboard lights dimmed slightly as if someone had tightened a hand on the electrics. It was quick, barely a second, and the heater fan kept turning like nothing had happened. I checked the battery gauge. It read normal. I put the van into gear, pulled up, and everything felt ordinary. It was one of those little failures you shrug at because nothing major came of it. I was out on foot for some of the deliveries. The closes are quicker that way, and I left the rear doors open to let the fog drift through the back of the van so it wouldn't hold the smell of other people's packages. The fog inside the bay made everything look soft and out of focus. I had a parcel for a first-floor flat, and when I climbed the steps, the stairwell lights dimmed as if they were being watched. The woman who answered the door had her hair in a towel and looked as if she'd expected noise and got a silence instead. She said nothing about it. People don't always say what they notice. It's easier to let odd things slide. When I got back to the van, the radio was doing the same thing again. Static, silence, static. I sat inside with the heater on and watched the droplets beat on the window. My scanner beeped and gave me a new code to drop off by the docks. The voice in my ear through the headset, Dave at dispatch, was clear at first, then his words flattened and hissed, and then came back as if he'd swallowed them and then spat them out. He asked if I could take an extra parcel, and I said yes without thinking. More. Because I didn't want to be the driver who said no. The call dropped. The headset showed no signal. 10 seconds later, it was fine. I drove toward the docks, following the familiar turns. The fog seemed to hug the van tighter the closer I got to the River Tay. There was a smell I couldn't place, a faint tang, metallic and a touch sweet, like someone had left a pot of pennies to molder. It made me think of old hospitals and things people keep in jars. I told myself that was ridiculous, but the smell lingered in the cab. Near the old B-listed warehouses, the fog thinned for a second and I saw a pale light hovering over the rooftops. It was the third odd thing, and the first that felt like a thing rather than a glitch. It wasn't a streetlight or a lamp. It was a soft, white glow, about the size of a slow-moving cloud pocket, just level with the terraced roofs. It floated without motion, not bobbing with the wind, just sitting there like a lantern hung in the wrong place. I pulled over because you pull over when you see something that isn't a thing you usually see, mostly because that gives you a chance to look without being foolish in a heap of traffic. There wasn't any traffic. The pause was brief, but the glow remained, an odd bead over the rows of houses. No sound from where it hung, no hum, no drone. There are nights when the fairy lights shine and sound can travel, but this wasn't that. The roofs below were dark, windows closed, and the glow didn't seem to touch any of the slate tiles. It simply sat in the fog, quiet and unmoving. The radio went to static again, like someone had drawn a curtain. And then the strange, small thing happened. When the glow shot upward, it did it so quickly it made my stomach go light. It shot straight up through the fog like someone had hoisted a wand from the ground. It didn't arc or leave a streak. It left a line of clearer air and then it was gone, up into the cloud layer and out of sight in a heartbeat. There was no sound at all to match that speed. No wind gust, nothing. It was as if it had entered a different room above the fog. The radio cleared. The bass line of the late-night show came back like a curtain being pulled aside. Dave's voice, full and steady, came through the headset asking where I'd parked. I answered, "Chest too quick," and he said he thought he'd lost me for a second because his screen showed me stopped in a place with no GPS signal. My hands were shaking, and I told myself that was nerves, nothing else. I was surprised how automatic the clearing felt. 1 second broken, the next perfectly fine, like someone had flicked a switch. I finished the last deliveries with my hands on the wheel like a man holding onto a rope. The city hummed again, that city hum that says nothing very dramatic is happening. Somewhere a pub door banged, and a bit later a taxi rolled by. I stopped for a coffee from a late-night van on the corner, and the two guys there were laughing about a football match. They hadn't seen anything in the fog, or if they had, they said nothing. You get that a lot. People choose not to mention the weird while it's happening. It's easier to compare notes later with someone who's been awake the same way you have. On the way back to base, My dash clock misbehaved. It skipped 30 seconds and then settled. My phone, which had been on 10%, showed battery as normal again. Small things went slippery. The scanner showed a missed scan that I later found in the back of the van. The route that should have taken me 15 minutes took 17. You add these up, and the number on the page is still small, but they leave a taste like pennies on the tongue. I unloaded the last crates at the depot and tried to laugh about it with Kenny, who parks next to me. He shrugged and said the fog plays games when you're tired. He's right. You get tired enough, and a lot of things start to rearrange. I told him about the pale light, and he said he'd heard a rumor of drone tests up the coast. He said it in a way that was both a story and a small hope. By the time I left the depot, the fog had cleared from the main roads into a mist that would blow away by morning. I drove home with the stereo low, the same cheeky presenter talking. I was fidgety. At the lights on my street, an old man outside his house waved at me, and I waved back. His face had that look people get when they've been waiting for someone to get home. I locked up and sat for a while in the kitchen with the kettle steaming, staring at the circle of condensation on the window where the street lamp made a faint halo. I didn't tell my partner everything. I told her the bits that sounded reasonable. A radio going off and on, odd battery readings, a bright light in the fog that shot off. She made tea and nodded, the way she does when my work is being strange. She asked if I was all right, and I said I was. The truth is, I kept thinking about how quickly the light had gone and about the silence that had held right before it. I kept thinking about the immediate clarity when the radio came back. It was the clearest thing, the one reliable detail among a night of small misbehaviors. Later, I watched back the little clip I'd taken on the dash cam. The footage showed fog, the van parked, the street, and at one frame, a pale blur rising. On replay, it skipped like bad splice work. One frame with the blur, the next frame gone. The audio track had a blot of static and then clear speech. The timestamps didn't match my watch by a few seconds. It's all the kind of proof that's easy to file away and harder to explain. I slept poorly that night, waking to the sound of rain at dawn. Outside, kids were playing, and the city was doing what cities do: scraping, sweeping, opening. The fog was remembered only in little puddles and a damp smell on the washing lines. I drove to work the next day and did my rounds, the roads bright and ordinary, people back from their holidays, buses on time. But sometimes when I'm filling the kettle and the evening is like it was, low and gray, I find myself listening for static in the radio or for a soft sound under everything. Mostly I don't hear it. Sometimes, out of habit, I glance at the rooftops. The memory sits like a small, unlabeled thing you keep in a drawer, precise enough to be real and slippery enough not to be pinned down. I was on the last leg to Farmington night flight, no weather to speak of. Clear sky, moon a sliver, the kind of night that makes you think of how small everything is. I was trimmed for 5,500, autopilot engaged, a half-empty thermos chilled inside the console. The radios were quiet except for the occasional flight-following handoff and a distant cargo truck on 121.5 sounding like it was 3 counties away. It was a routine leg. I had flown it dozens of times. Out the left window, something moved into the cone of the landing light and I almost missed it, because at first it read like a star. Then it didn't. It was too close for a star. It was at about the same angle off the nose as the wingtip, maybe 5-6 miles to the left, and I could swear it was at our altitude. It wasn't blinking, no red or green nav lights, no white strobes, just a dark, hard edge against the sky. The kind of shape that eats up starlight and holds it. At first, I told myself I was seeing traffic I hadn't expected. An unlit crop duster, a banner tow. I checked the transponder, toggled to ident, and listened for any TCAS warnings. Nothing. The EFIs showed the usual blank where traffic would display. My transponder was transmitting and the ADS-B box was showing the other traffic we'd heard earlier, so the equipment seemed to be working fine. Still, it held position relative to us like it belonged in the same lane of air. I called center. Center, Cessna 7KQH, visual traffic, left 2 o'clock, same altitude, say intentions. The voice came back from the other side of the headset clear and practiced. 7KQH, center, roger. We show no primary or secondary target in your area. Maintain present heading and altitude. No target. Copy, I said. I double-checked the heading on the HSI, glanced at the GPS track, then looked again out the window. The object had matched my ground track and my ground speed. Not perfectly in the way two airplanes occasionally sit beside each other, but it kept pace as if it were glued to our velocity vector, the dark edge maintaining that impossible station next to me. I disengaged the autopilot and put the yoke over, just to feel the motion. I banked left 3 degrees to get a better look, and the thing did something I couldn't find an easy word for. It rolled. Not banked or turned, but rolled, as if gravity had loosened its hold and it turned on an axis sideways, a slow, lazy roll unlike anything an airplane normally does. It slid then, laterally, exactly opposite my bank, with a fluidity like a model in water. It never accelerated in the hard sense. There was no plume, no wake. It simply moved. We could have been a matched pair of dancers and it complicating the choreography without effort. I called center again, voice steadier than I felt. Center, 7KQH. Right now the traffic's holding exactly parallel. It's rolling away to the west. Static hummed for a moment and the controller answered. A tone I now know means they were running the scope to see primary returns. Negative 7KQH. No targets. Are you receiving any interference? Negative on interference, I said. My headset had that small, precise noise the radios make when something is wrong, like when the squelch is being coaxed. I flipped the radio to ground to check the other frequency, confirmed the squelch, checked the standby, toggled the audio panel. Nothing. All the systems behaved normally. Pitot heat on, vacuum steady, alternator green. The clock in the panel blinked, then resumed. It was a list of ordinary things doing ordinary things, and the extraordinary thing outside doing nothing that fit. I reached for the binoculars I keep under the glare shield. They were cold and damp to the touch, like they'd been somewhere colder before I grabbed them. I held them up and got the shape. Vague, geometric, not like the rounded belly of most aircraft. The edges appeared matte, not reflecting the landing light at all, but the silhouette was crisp. I could see no windows, no tails, no prop blur. At the scales involved, I would have expected something to flicker or shimmer. There was nothing. It just existed and matched us. When I turned to take the head-on view, it did something else. I banked right and nudged the throttles to keep airspeed steady, because I didn't want to climb or descend and hand control back to the autopilot if I could help it. The object didn't follow in a straight chase. It reversed the feel of the moment by sliding away as if it had been tethered on a nearly invisible string, and someone eased it free. The roll completed like a lazy turn, and then it drifted. I'm being clumsy with words because I don't have a better one. Sideways down the horizon. And it did it with no noise, no thermal wake, the way a whirl of smoke disperses, only in reverse. I called approach on the guard channel, told them my tail number and that I had traffic visually at 1 o'clock, matching my altitude and gliding parallel. Approach, 7KQH. Excuse me, can you verify if any aircraft are in OMA sector? They came back quick. 7KQH, negative, we have no targets on primary in that sector. We're showing your transponder and other known traffic, but nothing else. So I asked the only question that mattered. Can you show me primary? Can you physically see anything on radar that corresponds to what I'm looking at right now? If we could, the controller said, we would, 7KQH. We have nothing. Say position and distance again. I gave a guess. Pilots estimate poorly at night. Approximately 2 to 3 miles left, same altitude. It was 2 minutes of me watching it go from being a curious puzzle to not being there at all. At some point, the silhouette narrowed and brightened like a lens-bending light. I thought it might ignite, strobe, or exhaust, some simple physical reveal. Instead, it tightened into a point, and then no phase change, no spray, nothing that you could point to as a mechanism. It simply winked out. One moment there was that indigo cut against the lower sky. The next, it was gone. No transit across the stars, no streak. The place where it had been was empty, like someone had lifted a birdcage. After that, all the small things unsettled in the cockpit turned larger. My watch, a cheap pilot's watch, was 5 minutes fast and then corrected itself. The thermos slid on the console for no reason when I eased back to neutral trim. My phone, which I had set to record when this started, had one file that corrupted into a single unopenable blob, and a second file that, on playback, showed 3 frames of a dark smear and then a blackness my phone described as unsupported. I told the controller I had recording and they'd mark it in the strip for the engineers, but they didn't ask for the file. They asked if I wanted to divert. I did not. There was nothing to divert to that made sense. We continued into Farmington like a ship resuming course after a passing, insignificant fog. My hands hovered a little above the yoke on the approach, as if not touching it would be safer. The wind held steady, the runway came up, and the landing was exactly the kind of wash of rightness these instruments train you for. On the ground, I taxied in slow and left the lights on, because the cabin still had that odd electric cooling I couldn't explain. I filled out the paperwork in the FBO between customers and tried to get someone to look at the files. Maintenance looked at my transponder traces and the ATC printout and at my GPS log. They found nothing out of order except one tiny anomaly in the GPS track where the ground speed showed a half-second blip. The controllers sent me the radar tape. It was clean where we'd been. "This sort of thing happens sometimes at night," one of them said, like that explained anything. I didn't expect an answer. I didn't think there'd be a report. I flew home in the morning and filed the routine incident notes and told my wife an abridged version because I didn't want to hand her the thing that felt like an accusation of instability. I kept turning that empty patch of sky over in my head. When I talk about it, people look for a category: weather balloon, experimental drone, a trick of the eye. None of those fit what I saw or didn't see. If anything has changed me, it's the way I check everything twice now. The transponder, the squitter, the frequency, the wing flex, even the thermos under the glare shield. I still fly at night. It's a job and I've been doing it a long time. But when I'm on the leg to Farmington now and something dark sits where a star used to be, I call it in a little sooner. The controller on the other end will still say nothing is showing. They always do. I was driving home late one night just outside Ashtabula when the fog started rolling in. Thick, low-hanging stuff that swallowed up the road and everything else around me. I hadn't planned on it getting that bad. One minute I was cruising along the usual stretch of Route 20 near Lake Erie, and the next, the world turned gray and dense, like someone had dumped a blanket over the whole town. My name's Dave Hollis, by the way, born and raised in this part of Ohio. I worked nights at a gas station in town, so this wasn't my first foggy drive. But this night was different. I was about 5 miles past Geneva, heading west toward home in Ashtabula, when I saw headlights coming at me through the mist. Pretty normal, right? Except the car never came close. It was like the headlights were floating in the fog, getting closer but never actually passing me. No engine sound, no tire noise on the wet road, just those 2 steady beams cutting through the gray. I slowed down, watching the lights. They stayed directly in front of me, maybe 100 yards away, moving like they wanted to meet me. I pulled over onto the gravel shoulder, hoping to give the other driver room to pass, but the lights just stopped, hanging there in the fog. I sat for a minute, staring into that murky nothing. The night was silent, except for the faint hum of my engine idling. Then, out of nowhere, something else showed up ahead. A soft glow, blue-white and kind of hazy, appeared about 50 yards down the road in the fog. It wasn't like any car light or street lamp I'd ever seen. It was just there, floating maybe 3 or 4 feet off the ground. I squinted, trying to make out what it was, but the fog kept swallowing it up. Then suddenly, that glow shot straight up, like someone flipped a switch. It shot up into the sky in a smooth, fast line and disappeared into the clouds above. I swear, right after it lifted, everything went dead quiet. The usual distant sounds, crickets, cars on the highway, even the hum of my own truck, all just stopped. It was like the whole world paused for a second. I sat frozen for a long moment. Then I shut the truck off, rolled down the window, and listened. Nothing. Not a bird, not a breeze, not even the usual crackle of insects in the weeds. When I finally turned the truck back on, the headlights were gone, the fog had thinned a little, and the normal sounds of the night came creeping back. I kept driving, eyes darting to every shadow and movement in the woods beside the road. The rest of the drive was uneventful. but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched or like something had slipped right past me in that fog. At home, I double checked the locks and sat for a while just staring out the window at the dark road. I still don't know what that light was or what it was doing out there, but I know I wasn't imagining the silence that followed. And if you ever find yourself driving through thick fog near Ashtabula late at night, watch those headlights closely. They might be what you think.